Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming, chapters 361 through 370 of the previous episode. Qian Pingyan reflects upon the wisdom he's gained during his time aboard Osmanthus Island, finding inner peace while admiring the sunrise. The following day, an old boatman returns a golden book that he salvaged from the sea, requesting Qian to give it to Lady Gui. Unsure if Lady Gui is spying on them, Qian feigns a lesson on philosophical principles, inadvertently creating a perfect scenario for the old boatman to save face while showing his goodwill. In gratitude, the boatman entrusts Qian with the delivery of the book. Their voyage draws to a close, and Lady Gui warns Qian of the harsh restrictions at Stalactite Mountain. Her concerns are abruptly silenced by a booming voice from the sky, announcing free passage for all Osmanthus Island passengers. Elated, Qian recognizes the voice. It is Aoyang, confirming his triumphant return after previously being knocked back down into the mortal realm. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 370. There was a large mountain hanging upside down somewhere in the world. The peak of the mountain pointed at the South Sea. Qian Pingyan sat on the branch of the ancestor Osmanthus tree, and dazedly gazed at this stunning scene. Ning Yao had set off from here to journey across majestic world. He had heard that Southern World Continent was the closest continent to Stalactite Mountain, so would Lu Xianying come here to take a look in the future? Osmanthus Island still needed to travel for approximately half a day before it would truly enter the territory of Stalactite Mountain. All kinds of ships came and went around them, and there were giant turtles with stone tablets on their backs, clams with crystalline and translucent shells drifting on the sea, Kuan ships that were even larger than that owned by Ceremony Mountain slowly descending, a collection of iridescent clouds bringing with them countless oriental magpies, rows of immortal cranes and azure birds tugging along a tall building, and so on. Osmanthus Island didn't seem the least bit out of place among them. Qian Pingyan suddenly turned around and looked down. He saw that young girl again, her figure lithe, her appearance beautiful, a pearl hairpin in her hair, a dress on her body, and a colorful ribbon around her waist. However, Qian Pingyan's skin was crawling, and he felt extremely uneasy. In fact, this feeling was even more intense and direct than when he had seen Lu Qiqing dressed in pink Taoist robes in front of the rundown temple back then. This was because Qian Pingyan could see this beautiful girl's Adam's apple. He didn't detest this, but he was indeed very unaccustomed to it. Qian Pingyan suddenly scratched his head and stared directly at the man who liked to dress like a woman. The uneasiness in his heart vanished, transforming instead into a hint of nostalgia. Back when he was an apprentice in the dragon kiln, Qian Pingyan had been acquainted with a man whom others always ridiculed as a sissy. That man was timid, and he had walked in a very feminine manner. When speaking, he had also liked to throw flirtatious glances and make orchid-shaped fingers. In the dragon kiln managed by Old Man Yao, this man had naturally faced the most discrimination. If he finally saved enough money to buy a pair of new shoes, it was guaranteed that they would be stepped on and dirted by the other kiln workers on the same day. However, he wouldn't dare to say anything, and he would simply suffer in silence. Logically speaking, both he and Qian Pingyan should have sympathized with each other, given that Qian Pingyan was also discriminated against in the dragon kiln. Strangely, however, the man who always sobbed and cried would immediately become very brave in front of Qian Pingyan. He would always taunt Qian Pingyan and speak to the young boy in a very unpleasant manner. However, Qian Pingyan had never paid any heed to him. On quite a few occasions, the man had been caught by Lu Xianying, Old Man Yao's official disciple, while taunting Qian Pingyan. Lu Xianying had directly slapped him and sent him spinning on the spot, causing him to immediately shut up and behave. Afterward, the man would secretly bring some snacks and desserts to Lu Xianying's room, wrapping them up in a manner even more exquisite than shop attendants. He had most likely been apologizing to, and perhaps sucking up to Lu Xianying, someone who was destined to become the future manager of the dragon kiln. The paper cuttings decorating the windows in the dragon kiln had also been made by him. He had endured many late nights by himself to create these, and even the women in the streets and alleys would feel that their works were inferior. If this person were genuinely a woman, just how brilliant would his needlework be? Qian Pingyan had naturally detested the barb-tongued sissy back then. However, he had also been afraid of severely wounding the man in a single punch if he were unable to hold back. At that time, the young boy had already traversed all of the mountains and rivers surrounding the small town with Old Man Yao. Chopping wood and burning charcoal had also become extremely familiar tasks. Not only that, but he had also practiced breathing techniques taught to him by Old Man Yang since very early on. As such, his strength had already been equivalent to, if not greater than, strong young men. In the end, the feminine man had made a huge mistake when guarding the night one time. He had unexpectedly extinguished the flames in a dragon kiln. Terrified by this, he had fled during the night. Having some smarts, he hadn't dared to run toward the small town, and he had instead fled deep into the mountains and forests. If such grave mistakes were committed in some shop in the market, it would be a mistake severe enough to warrant death. Upon learning of this, Old Man Yao had immediately sent dozens of strong young men after that bastard with a dark expression. Chen Ping'an, who was extremely familiar with the mountain paths, was naturally part of the group. 2 days later, the feminine man had been tied up and marched back to the dragon kiln. Old Man Yao had then immediately broken his hands and legs, beating him so severely that his flesh had been mangled and his bones had been revealed. The group of men who had found him was the group that he always flattered the most. No one had felt any sympathy for this feminine man who had caused such a huge disaster. Even if they had, they wouldn't have dared to show it on their faces. After all, Old Man Yao had almost never been this angry before. Before having his arms and legs broken, the feminine man had already wet his pants in fright. Afterward, he had shaken uncontrollably upon being forced to lie on the ground. When the beating started, he had screamed hysterically with tears and snot streaming down his face. As the beating continued, the feminine man had been like a fish being cut alive on a chopping board. The feminine man was indeed a sissy, after all, and he had never shown an ounce of manliness and backbone from the beginning to the end, all the way until he finally fainted. In the end, the feminine man had surprisingly survived the merciless beating. He had stubbornly lived on, laying on a sickbed for almost half a year to recuperate. During this time, many apprentices in the dragon kiln had taken turns looking after him, with Chen Ping'an naturally being no exception. However, many people had been dissatisfied with this difficult task, so they had sought out Chen Ping'an and asked him to take their place, what with Chen Ping'an being the most agreeable person in the dragon kiln. In the end, it was actually the young boy whom the feminine man disliked the most who had wound up looking after him the most. The two of them had refused to engage in any conversation with each other, highlighting the mutual dislike between them. Chen Ping'an had simply gathered ingredients and cooked medicine for him every day, while the feminine man had occasionally become adrift and dazedly stared at the old paper cutting on the window that was losing their color after being punished by the wind and rain. Perhaps he had been dreaming of a day when he could finally leave the bed again. At that time, he would definitely find some spare time between work to replace this paper cutting with a beautiful and brand new paper cutting that was a brilliant red color. However, the bedridden feminine man who had survived his severe beating and gritted his teeth to return from the brink of death had still ultimately died. He had been killed by a single comment. That had been a casual comment by a kiln worker. Chen Ping'an had been cooking medicine by the door at that time, with his back facing the kiln worker and the feminine man. The former had chuckled and remarked that during the day of the beating when the feminine man's clothes were torn to shreds, his pale bottom had truly looked like that of a woman. Chen Ping'an hadn't felt comment was extremely inappropriate. After all, the men in the dragon kiln had taunted the feminine man with much more vicious comments than this before. Moreover, the feminine man had almost never argued with other people, most likely because he didn't dare to. Indeed, the most he would do was probably curse them behind their back, saying something like, "You dare to taunt me? Do you want me to blow up the graves of your ancestors?" However, it was after hearing this seemingly mundane comment that the feminine man, who could already sit up by himself, had surprisingly chatted a lot with Chen Ping'an on that day. It had mostly been him speaking, while the taciturn young boy had quietly listened. When talking about paper cutting, Chen Ping'an had sincerely praised his skills and remarked on the beauty of his work. The feminine man had smiled upon hearing this. On that night, the feminine man whose courage was even tinier than that of a needle's eye had unexpectedly used a pair of scissors to stab himself in the throat. Not only that, but he hadn't forgotten to cover himself with a blanket, preventing those who entered his room from immediately seeing his final posture of death. In fact, no one had dared to collect his corpse and bring it out of the room. Truly, the scene was far too inauspicious. Fortunately, Chen Ping'an was already accustomed to death befalling those around him, so he hadn't paid much heed to the inauspicious nature of the situation. In the end, he had dragged Lu Xianying around with him and busily sorted out the mess. He hadn't felt especially sad during this time, nor had he obtained any kind of enlightenment. Only when wakekeeping had Chen Ping'an sat by himself in an empty and eerie morning hall. He hadn't felt any fear, and he had sat beside the stove and murmured, "Since you didn't like being a man in this life, then you should reincarnate into a woman in your next life." In fact, during their idle chatter on that fateful day, the feminine man had asked Chen Ping'an why he had let him go even though he had been the first one to find him. Not only that, but the young boy had even pointed out a small path leading deeper into the mountains. Chen Ping'an had replied that he was afraid of old man Yao beating the feminine man to death if he were caught. At that time, with the feminine man's sesame-sized courage, he would only dare to exact revenge on him and not anyone else. The feminine man had smiled very happily upon hearing this. Thinking back to it now, the feminine man's smile had in fact been fairly ugly. However, the young boy genuinely didn't feel any disgust toward it. The lithe and radiantly beautiful young girl, standing under the osmanthus tree, was already seething with rage. To have someone so boldly stare at her, or more precisely him. If he weren't afraid of damaging the osmanthus tree and causing unnecessary trouble, he would have immediately summoned his 2 bonded flying swords to stab this lecherous bastard to death. Chen Ping'an came to his senses and also realized his unintentional act of rudeness. He cupped his fists and said apologetically, "I'm sorry, I was a bit distracted just then." The young man narrowed his peach blossom eyes, seemingly filled with the colors and radiance of spring. He then brought his index finger and middle finger together, and made a stabbing motion at Chen Ping'an before wagging them slightly back and forth. His action was as provocative as could be. Instead of keeping his head turned, Chen Ping'an decided to directly turn his entire body around. He patted the empty space beside him on the tall branch and chuckled, "As an apology, I'll allow you to sit here and enjoy the view of Stalactite Mountain on Lady Gui's behalf." The young man clasped his hands behind his back and looked up with his face delicate and tender as the spring breeze. He smiled and asked, "Do you like men? Or do you like both men and women as long as they're beautiful enough?" Chen Ping'an could feel a headache forming, and he vigorously shook his head to express his innocence. He naturally liked females only. In fact, he only liked a single girl. Standing under the osmanthus tree, 2 wisps of sword chi materialized near the clasped hands of the young man, 1 gold and 1 silver. They were extremely subtle and almost invisible to the naked eye. It was clear that he was going to use his flying swords to kill if a disagreement arose between them. Chen Ping'an hesitated for a moment before smiling and saying this might anger you even more, but you look very good in this kind of outfit. Chen Ping'an rested his hands on the branch and added with limpid eyes, "I say this from the bottom of my heart." The young man, cross-dressing as a woman, furrowed his brows. He silently walked away. However, he didn't leave the mountain peak, and he simply walked near the railing of the observation deck and gazed into the distance. Chen Ping'an leaped down from the tall branch and shouted at the young man whose back was facing him, "I'm leaving now. If you want to enjoy the view from the top of the osmanthus tree, then it's best that you seize this opportunity when there are fewer people. Otherwise, Lady Gui might become unhappy." The young man didn't respond. Only when Chen Ping'an was far away did he turn around to glance at the osmanthus tree. After hesitating for a long time, he eventually decided against climbing up the tree to gaze at Stalactite Mountain from a higher vantage point. As for the 2 wisps of sword chi, he had already retracted them into the colorful ribbon around his waist a long time ago. In fact, those 2 wisps of sword chi weren't sword chi at all. Rather, they were seemingly unremarkable flying swords that were actually extremely high-grade bonded flying swords. Their names were Needle Tip and Weed On. He had been born with them. He was a genuine innate sword talent. Moreover, to be born with 2 bonded flying swords was a chance smaller than 1 in 10,000 for sword cultivators. The keyword wasn't 1, but smaller. Most importantly, the quality of his flying swords was absolutely terrifying. Thus, his master had stated that his aptitude would definitely allow him to reach the upper 5 tiers. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken him as a disciple. As for exactly how many years it would take him to advance to the unpolished jade tier, his master hadn't made any mention of this, and he hadn't asked about it either. He had no interest in learning about this. Indeed, he was more fascinated and obsessed with divination techniques pertaining to the Great Tao. However, it was a shame that his master had said that he couldn't make it very far on this path, and that he couldn't inherit his master's lineage through this. Including his master, all of his senior brothers and junior brothers encouraged him to practice the sword. In reality, he was well aware of the fact that they weren't sincerely hoping for his sword Tao to truly reach the peak and become dominant. Instead, they harbored ill intentions, and they wanted to see him fail and make a joke of himself. The reason for this was very simple. He was afraid of heights. A sword cultivator who was afraid of heights. Just what kind of joke was this? When he occasionally stepped on his sword to ride on the wind, he would never rise more than 6 meters from the ground. The young man glanced at the branch which the young boy had sat on just then, and he felt like he himself was also an utter idiot. Chen Ping'an returned to the Guimai courtyard. Ma Ji, the golden courtier sword cultivator, was already standing inside and waiting for him with a smile. A while back, Chen Ping'an had decided to visit the courtyard where Ma Ji was resting and recuperating, asking him when they could continue to practice the sword. 3 days later, the Guimai courtyard had returned to the same way as before. Ma Ji practiced sword techniques with Chen Ping'an, while Jinsu was responsible for their 3 meals a day. Lady Gue would occasionally visit the small courtyard, and she wouldn't disturb Chen Ping'an or Ma Ji. She would quietly sit there for a while and at most make a pot of tea for the two of them. One time, Chen Ping'an had retrieved the talisman paper where the female skeletal ghost was kept. Holding the paper talisman in her hand, Lady Gue had quickly shaken the skeletal ghost out and allowed her to finally see the light of day again. However, the female ghost in white who had been extremely aggressive in the city god temple in Colorful Garment Nation was immediately greeted by the nascent tier Lady Gue, the old boatman who had fallen from the golden courtier, as well as her enemy, Chen Ping'an. If she weren't already dead, she would have definitely been scared to death. In the end, with the help of Lady Gue, who was the pseudo-sage of Osmanthus Island, the beautiful skeletal ghost made an oath to loyally serve Chen Ping'an for 60 years. In return, she could leave the talisman paper where her soul would slowly fade away if spiritual energy wasn't funneled inside. She was allowed to stay inside Chen Ping'an's locust wood sword case instead. Because locust trees have been referred to as locust residences since ancient times, it wasn't just grass spirits and wood spirits that were especially fond of locust trees that were over 1,000 years old. Ghosts and entities were also extremely fond of them. As they neared Stalactite Mountain, there was one starry night when the old boatman suddenly visited Chen Ping'an and brought him to the dock at the foot of the mountain on Osmanthus Island. When Chen Ping'an arrived, he discovered a young flood dragon lying on the dock with its head resting on the shore, and more than half of its body still in the sea. Gazing at Chen Ping'an, its eyes were filled with childish curiosity and gratitude. The old boatman squatted beside the shore and clicked his tongue in wonder, remarking, "In terms of human age, this pitiful little creature is only equivalent to 6 or 7 years old." Lady Gue was unwilling to make things difficult for this innocent little creature at the time, so she only took the Dragon King basket and set the little flood dragon free. Unexpectedly, however, it seems like it has no home to return to, so it quickly caught up to Osmanthus Island again. However, it didn't dare to get too close, so it continued to whimper every night as it circled around Osmanthus Island and refused to leave. Now that we're getting closer and closer to Stalactite Mountain, the little flood dragon most likely understands that it will face certain death if it follows Osmanthus Island forward. So it whimpers loudly even during the day. If it weren't for Lady Gue taking pity on it and helping it conceal its aura, I'm afraid it would have been skinned alive and killed by those chi refiners from the mountains who still have lingering anger in their hearts. In the end, the old boatman smiled and said, "Chen Ping'an, it seems like the little flood dragon has especially come here to look for you. However, I'm unsure about whether it wants to thank you or exact revenge on you. Even though it's still very young, flood dragons and their kin are known for their cold-bloodedness and sly nature. So this is quite hard to say." Chen Ping'an didn't say anything. He simply took out an ordinary snake gall pebble and tossed it to the young flood dragon. The young flood dragon instinctively wolfed it down with a rather confused look in its eyes. Chen Ping'an had then waved his hands and gestured for the young flood dragon to leave. After turning around and returning to the sea, the young flood dragon whimpered softly, still unwilling to leave the vicinity of Osmanthus Island. After pondering for a moment, Chen Ping'an had surprisingly tossed a large handful of ordinary snake gall pebbles into the sea. The young flood dragon vigorously twisted and turned in the sea, creating huge waves as it swallowed the incredible delicacies one by one. Afterward, Chen Ping'an stood on the dock and said to the young flood dragon, "Remember to cultivate earnestly in the future. You've accepted my favor today, so I'll smash you to death with a single punch if you end up finding joy in harming others like that elder of yours." Upon hearing this, the young flood dragon swam back to the dock and raised its head above the shore. It opened its eyes wide, as if trying to burn Chen Ping'an's appearance into its memory. After a brief moment, it then leaned back and returned to the vast sea. The old boatman had experienced all kinds of things before, and he sighed with emotion. "You have a kind heart, and you planted a seed of positive karma. However, the world is unpredictable, and seeds of positive karma will not necessarily grow into fruits of positive outcome." With an apathetic expression on his face, Chen Ping'an gazed at the sea upon which the specks of stars were glittering like gold and silver, saying softly, "If it transforms into negative karma, then I'll draw my sword and eliminate it with a single slash." At that time, the old boatman was thinking about his master who was going to vanish for heaven knows how many years again. He was also thinking about that golden text left behind by an immortal that Chen Ping'an had helped deliver to him. Because of this, he didn't pay much attention to Chen Ping'an's expression and words. In Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy, the young classmates who had left the Greatly Empire together were destined to no longer spend all their time together after arriving in this academy. Indeed, Li Huai had already made 2 new friends. A cowardly child from a powerful clan in the capital, and an extremely courageous rascal from a poor family. They were both slightly older than Li Huai, and the 3 of them would always play together and go crazy. They enjoyed themselves immensely. Meanwhile, Lin Shuyi was now obsessed with cultivation, and he would always travel between the scripture library, his dormitory, and the classrooms. He read all the books he could and he stood out from the crowd. Yu Lu had a close relationship with Prince Gao Xian from Great Sui Nation, and the 2 of them eventually became good friends. Gao Xian became increasingly fond of visiting the academy to fish with Yu Lu. Apart from attending classes, Xie seldom ventured out of her dormitory. She willingly acted as a maidservant for Cui Dongshan. After Li Baoping read another letter from her junior uncle, the little girl appeared to be downcast for a very long time. On this day, she skipped class again and was as agile as a small cat as she nimbly climbed atop the large tree located on the peak of the East Mountain. She sat on a branch and leaned on the tree trunk. Her self-crafted wooden badge with the characters Alliance Leader of the Martial Arts World was hanging around her neck, and she had engraved the characters Commands All Lords afterward because she had felt like the badge still wasn't impressive enough. Afterward, she hadn't been able to stop herself from engraving more and more impressive phrases onto the wooden badge. These were all grand phrases from the cultivation world that she had copied from the storybooks. For example, "Invincible, I lament the lack of rivals in my life," and so on. A spirited and handsome young boy in white stood on a branch beside her. He gently bounced up and down with the movement of the branch, and there was a smile on his face as he asked, "What's wrong? Are you angry about something?" With the arrival of summer, the little girl was now wearing a red shirt and a long red skirt instead of a thick red jacket. "I'm not angry," she replied in a sullen voice. "Do you feel like Li Huai, Lin Shuyi, and the others are growing more and more distant from you?" Gui Dongshan asked. "It doesn't matter if they grow more distant from me," the little girl huffed in reply. "After all, I never liked interacting with them even when we went to school together in the small town." "Then you're unhappy about the injustice that my teacher is facing?" Cui Dongshan asked with a knowing smile. "Emichim." The little girl was a straightforward person, and she nodded boldly and acknowledged this. Cui Dongshan rested his hands behind his head and said with emotion, "Everyone grows up, and growing up will inevitably cause one to pick up some new things and discard some old things. In this process of picking things up and discarding things, in the blink of an eye, one quickly grows old. They're even willing to discard junior uncle? The little girl fumed. Cui Dongshan turned around to look at the furious little girl. He smiled faintly and replied, "Why wouldn't they be willing to? In any case, my teacher won't become angry even if he learns of this. That being the case, what are you getting all worked up for? There's absolutely no need." The little girl angrily crossed her arms. Cui Dongshan turned back around to gaze at the capital of Great Sui Nation. In the future, you might become very good friends with someone, and the two of you will share many intimate conversations together as you grow up. However, she might get married one day, and she'll eventually like her husband more than you. You might also come across a teacher who's even better than Qi Jingchun, and you might one day feel that Mr. Qi's knowledge wasn't the most profound in the world. One day in the future you might also encounter an impressive young boy who's even better than your junior uncle. At that time, you'll discover that your current worry and sadness is only temporary and nothing very important. You'll drink 1 or 2 sips of wine, and all of this worry and sadness will flow away just like that. Cui Dongshan suddenly turned around and exclaimed in astonishment, "Little Baoping, you actually didn't offer a retort? If you don't say something, then I'll run out of things to say." The little girl scrunched up her pretty little face and replied, "I'm busy feeling sad." Cui Dongshan chortled with laughter as he fell back and coincidentally lay sideways on a thin branch. He held his head up with a single hand and gazed at the little girl in red. One day in the future, this little girl would grow taller and taller, and her round little face would also become skinnier and sharper. Her eyes might still be as watery as always, and they might still be pure and filled with energy. She might still be dressed in red, and she might ride a horse along the riverbanks and drink wine in the mountains. However, she would probably come across joyful events and sad events as well, right?
Cui Dongshan evda faint sig.
He felt slightly anxious. If such a good girl genuinely ended up liking his teacher, that would indeed be a very worrisome thing. If one day she unexpectedly didn't like his teacher anymore, that might be an even more disappointing thing. Cui Dongshan turned his body and closed his eyes. He then crossed his legs and went to sleep. As for those chance encounters and diverging relationships, Cui Dongshan was thoroughly aware of them even though his body was young. After all, those experiences and challenges were all accumulated in his heart. His awareness of them was no inferior to that of the Great Li Empire's imperial preceptor Cui Chan. There was one thing that he hadn't told the little girl. He Cui Dongshan, as well as the old Cui Chan, Zuiyu Mao Xiaodong, and the others including Qi Jingchun, had all enjoyed shade under the old scholar in the past. They had slowly grown up, and in the end, they had all hoped to walk out from that incredibly large patch of shade. Those who succeeded continued on their way. Those who failed, however, saw their hearts slowly change. The little girl nearby put her wooden badge away and carefully retrieved a painting from her clothes. It was a painting of Chen Ping'an standing under an osmanthus tree and smiling at her. Her worries were immediately washed away, and a smile stretched across her face as she happily said, "Junior uncle truly looks so handsome after learning to drink. When I grow older, I'm definitely going to adventure around the cultivation world with junior uncle." Li Baoping became more and more excited thinking about this, and she turned around and asked loudly, "Cui Dongshan, is it difficult to drink? You're not allowed to drink."
Cui Dongshan replied resolutely.
"Why not?"
Li Baoping fumat.
"Teacher isn't willing to scold you at all, but he'll directly beat me to death."
Cui Dongshan replied in a sulky voice.
Li Baoping sighed and shook her head, saying in pity, "How pitiful." Cui Dongshan stole a glance at the little girl who had a beaming smile on her face. "Little Baoping, please hide your smile of pleasure away when trying to console others in the future." Li Baoping feigned grabbing a seal and stamping it down. Cui Dongshan sighed in grief and muttered, "My good intentions are repaid with ungratefulness." Between Stalactite Mountain and the vast sea, there were numerous paths that hovered in midair like ribbons of clouds and water. These were paths that allowed intercontinental ships to arrive at the mountain. In fact, the many intercontinental ships that could fly through the air also had to descend to the sea and take these paths. They weren't allowed to directly approach Stalactite Mountain. Osmanthus Island momentarily stopped at a dock located beneath one such path. After symbolically handing over a document similar to a clearance document, they were exempt from paying the astronomical toll usually required. The island started to drift towards Stalactite Mountain following the angled river path. Stalactite Mountain measured 50 kilometers in radius. However, as a lone mountain above the sea, it controlled a vast region around the mountain. A tall and sturdy Taoist with the appearance of a middle-aged man stood atop some cliff face. There was a skinny old Taoist priest with the demeanor of a transcendent being standing behind him with a fly whisk in hand, and all of the strands of the fly whisk were golden and silver whiskers of fled dragons. "Teacher, do you need this student to take action and destroy Osmanthus Island?" the old Taoist priest asked in a quiet voice. "I agreed to the bet, so I'm willing to accept the loss. There's nothing embarrassing about this. I'm not your grand teacher after all, someone who hasn't suffered a single defeat in his life," the tall and sturdy Taoist replied with a smile. While the great heavenly lord in Stalactite Mountain spoke, a Taoist priest was smashed into the mortal world from the heavens beyond heavens, in the heavenly world with a single punch. Standing at the dock located at the foot of the mountain on Osmanthus Island, Chan Ping'an took a small step and arrived at Stalactite Mountain. Before arriving at Stalactite Mountain, Aunt Gui had told Chan Ping'an that Osmanthus Island would experience its busiest moments immediately after it docked at Stalactite Mountain. During this time, all of the goods from Eastern Treasured Vial Continent, Complete Reed Continent, and Parasol Leaf Continent would need to be unloaded without any mistake. Otherwise, the time-honored reputation of Old Dragon City's fan clan would be ruined. Because of this, she, the old boatman, and Ma Ji needed to personally keep an eye on the handover of every single item. As such, they wouldn't have time to leave the island with Chan Ping'an and bring him to an inn on Stalactite Mountain. Aunt Gui had initially wanted Jin Su to bring Chan Ping'an to the inn, which had been on friendly terms with Osmanthus Island for many generations, but Chan Ping'an had politely turned down this offer. This had caused Jin Su to grumble with slight dissatisfaction in her mind. Stalactite Mountain was filled with all kinds of wondrous things, so much so that one would never tire of them. Visitors would be able to find fresh and marvelous things no matter how many times they visited. However, the slightly dispirited Osmanthus girl suddenly saw the young boy turn around and crack a grin at her, as if he had seen through her thoughts. Jin Su shot a vicious glare at him. Chan Ping'an waved goodbye to Lady Gui, the old boatman, and Ma Ji. Then, as if he didn't dare to catch Jin Su's gaze again, he turned around and quickly ran to the entrance of Stalactite Mountain. Jin Su couldn't help but giggle. Chan Ping'an took a deep breath as he walked among the flowing throng of people. He had finally arrived. One couldn't pass through Stalactite Mountain and enter the Sword Chi Great Wall whenever and wherever they wanted. Apart from needing an Azurewood clearance badge to enter Stalactite Mountain, the 100 or so people who needed to pass through another checkpoint to enter the Sword Chi Great Wall were given an additional jade tablet as well. At the same time, they were informed that they could pass through the checkpoint at midnight in 3 days' time. They would have 15 minutes to pass before it was time for the next group, and they would be refused entry if they missed this time slot. After leaving Osmanthus Island, Chan Ping'an kept a white jade tablet hanging from his waist. This was a jade tablet that only had a single character inscribed on it: border. Aunt Gui had told him that all kinds of scenery existed on Stalactite Mountain, and that there were also a myriad stores that sold all kinds of goods. Thus he should take advantage of these 3 days to travel around as much as he could. If he came across any immortal treasure or artifact that he fancied, but he didn't have enough money on hand to purchase them, he could borrow money from the manager of that inn. The manager would definitely agree to lend him money if it was fewer than 10 grain rain coins. Moreover, according to the agreements between them, this debt would be recorded under Osmanthus Island. The dock on the mountain cliff was called the Catch and Release Dock, and this name had originated from an ancient pavilion nearby that had a very long history. A plaque with the characters Catch and Release Pavilion hung on the ancient structure, and these characters had been personally written by the former branchmaster of a Taoist branch. There were 9 structures in Stalactite Mountain that belonged to the Taoist sect of this world, while the remaining tall buildings, large courtyards, and all kinds of shops had already been sold to other people from all over the world. Among these 9 structures, 8 were located on 8 different sides of Stalactite Mountain. They were the Catch and Release Pavilion, Sword Reverence Pagoda, Incense Offering Tower, Lightning Lake Platform, Ganoderma Inn, Taoist Seal Hall, Taoist Saber Room, and Milu Cliff. Including the Lone Peak located in the central region, there were 9 structures and territories in total. Even though Stalactite Mountain measured around 50 kilometers in radius, the Taoist branch led by the second disciple of the Tao ancestor didn't occupy a significant area of this land. In fact, neither the territory nor the number of disciples belonging to this branch was very large. Young Master Chan, young Master Chan. Someone strained their voice and loudly called out behind Chan Ping'an. He turned around, only to see the young boy in green who had introduced himself as Lu Yuzhou. The young boy jogged over to Chan Ping'an and immediately fired off a long list of questions as if pouring beans from a bucket. Young Master Chan, where are you staying in Stalactite Mountain? Have you made a reservation yet? If you haven't, then why don't you go to my place? My clan owns an estate here. It's close to a place called the Sword Reverence Pagoda. I've heard that the estate is fairly big. I've always wanted to thank you. So how about you give me the opportunity right now? Chan Ping'an shook his head and replied with a smile. There's no need. Osmanthus Island has already organized everything for me, and I'll be staying at Stork Inn. Disappointment spread across the face of the young boy from the pure white continent. He was unwilling to give up and he persuaded, is that so? Then how about I look for you afterward? This is my first time in Stalactite Mountain, so I need to take a good look around. Do you want to go around together? Chan Ping'an faltered upon hearing this. Young master, the two of you only met by chance recently and are still unfamiliar with each other, so it's unreasonable for you to be so overly friendly so soon, the old woman beside Lu Yuzhou said. To say nothing of the fact that young Master Chan won't dare to agree to your request, even I wouldn't agree to it if I were in his place. Chan Ping'an smiled and remained silent. All right, the young boy replied with a dejected expression. Young Master Chan, I'm staying at the Ape Havoc Estate, so you can look for me there if you have nothing else to do. Ask for Lu Yuzhou, and tell them that you're my friend. I'll keep that in mind, Chan Ping'an replied with a nod. Chan Ping'an, Lu Yuzhou, and the old woman turned around in unison. There was a beautiful young woman standing nearby, and it looked as if she were hesitating about whether she should speak. A warm smile appeared on the old woman's face, and she looked a withered tree experiencing a new spring. Young esteemed immortal, is there something troubling you? She asked in a pleasant and amicable voice. However, the young immortal ignored the old woman and directly stared at Chan Ping'an, saying, Oi, can you lend me a grain rain coin? I'll return 3 or 5 to you in the future. Chan Ping'an handed the young immortal a grain rain coin. The latter accepted the coin and left with a smile. Young Master Chan, is she your friend? Lu Yuzhou asked. We don't know each other, Chan Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. Lu Yuzhou was astonished and he exclaimed, Then why did you lend her money? Don't you know that beautiful young women are the best in the world at cheating people? Young Master Chan, allow me to be nosy and say something else. No matter how little 1 grain rain coin is worth, you still can't travel around the cultivation world with such an attitude. Chan Ping'an grimaced and bade farewell. 1 grain rain coin is worth little? A beautiful young woman? The old woman couldn't contain her laughter and she chuckled. Young master, did you not realize that the pretty young woman was actually a man? Lu Yuzhou was stupefied and he replied in a quiet voice. I was busy stealing glances at her face and figure just then, but I didn't dare to look too much. The old woman had no option but to correct Lu Yuzhou again, stressing, Young master, that person isn't a young woman. Lu Yuzhou flicked his sleeve and strode forward, saying, With how beautiful he is, I'll pretend that he's a young woman. Chan Ping'an didn't hurry over to Stork Inn straight away. Instead, he followed the flow of people to the nearby catch and release pavilion. When Chan Ping'an arrived near the small but overcrowded pavilion, he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He felt pavilion didn't live up to its fame. It was extremely small, and it was in fact even smaller than the Mountain and Water Pavilion in Sword Saint Song Sword Water Villa in colorful Garment Nation. There were over 100 people standing inside and outside the pavilion already, and Chan Ping'an stood on his tippy toes to glance at the small pavilion that couldn't fit a mouse, let alone another person. After having a quick look, he was just about to turn around and leave. However, it was at this moment that a familiar voice sounded behind him again, sounding as feminine as the person's appearance. You're not going to enter the pavilion and look around for a short while? Chan Ping'an turned around and smiled at the young man standing beside him, replying, It's far too crowded in there, so I don't dare to go. I'm afraid that I won't be able to make it out. The young man pointed at 3 young women standing not far in front of them, and it was as if they were also undecided about whether they should enter the catch and release pavilion. He smiled faintly and said, "Just follow me and think about this as me paying interest on the grain rain coin." Chen Ping'an had no idea what was going on. The young man pointed at his Adam's apple with a strange smile.
En illusion technique.
Chen Ping'an asked in an uncertain voice, "Lend me your wine gourd for a while. Rest assured, I won't covet a small and crappy wine gourd. My sword-nurturing gourd can be regarded as its old ancestor, and I simply don't dare to wear it on my waist," the young man replied. He nodded at Chen Ping'an before grabbing the wine gourd from the young boy's waist without another word. He briskly walked over to the 3 young women with above-average appearances, tilting his head and drinking wine as he did so. And thus, he displayed both the appearance of a breathtakingly beautiful woman and the carefree and mighty nature of a man. A short moment later, the young man stood amid the group of young women and beckoned Chen Ping'an over. The young boy had no option but to walk over. The young man introduced him using a dialect that he couldn't understand, but he repeated his words to Chen Ping'an afterward using the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. As it turned out, the 3 young women were sect disciples from Southern World Continent, and they were traveling through other continents as a group. They were on a training mission, and they needed to slay a Dragon Gate Tier C demon to successfully complete their training. Their final destination was Stalactite Mountain, and they would return to their sect in Southern World Continent after visiting. Afterward, the young man would hear no complaints as he grabbed Chen Ping'an's elbow and charged toward the catch and release pavilion with the 3 celestial maidens from Southern World Continent. There was an interesting backstory regarding the catch and release pavilion. It was said that the second disciple of the Tao ancestor, one of the 3 branch masters of the Taoist orthodoxy from Heavenly World, True Invincible, had personally come to this place after tossing down the largest mountain seal. At that time, a great demon at the peak stage of the 12th tier had used some unknown techniques to sneak past the numerous restrictions at the Sword Chi Great Wall and arrive at the mountain seal, also known as Stalactite Mountain. However, the first person encountered by the great demon had coincidentally been that Taoist branch master. Back then, Stalactite Mountain had still been a desolate region with no population to speak of, so the great demon had initially thought that it could do as it pleased. Upon seeing the Taoist branch master, it had naturally spoken in an offensive manner and wanted to gobble him up in a single mouthful. In terms of the outcome, this went without saying. The great demon was smacked half dead by the Taoist branch master. However, its final fate was still unknown. The old Taoist branch master, regarded as the strongest fighter in the 4 worlds, tossed the great demon back to someplace south of the Sword Chi Great Wall. Thus, future generations of Taoists built this pavilion to represent the paramount Tao power of that branch master. Chen Ping'an was exhausted by this trip to the catch and release pavilion, with his entire back drenched in sweat. This was because the 3 celestial maidens and the young man who was even more beautiful than them would inevitably face accidental bumps or purposeful body contact when walking around the bustling pavilion. Thus, Chen Ping'an could only do his best to protect them. At the same time, he also had to prevent himself from accidentally making contact with them. This was naturally taxing on both the body and the mind, especially since there were subtle struggles and battles everywhere. Fortunately, the number 1 rule in Stalactite Mountain was that those who injured others would be punished by death. Because of this, Chen Ping'an was able to successfully protect the group as a 4th-tier martial artist. After finally leaving the catch and release pavilion, Chen Ping'an and the young man parted ways with the 3 celestial maidens. The young women were still headed toward the nearest attraction, Milu Cliff. Chen Ping'an took his sword-nurturing gourd back and tied it back at his waist. "Don't do things in the future," he said in exasperation. The young man rolled his eyes at Chen Ping'an and grumbled, "How boring. I'll go and play with the celestial maidens instead." Chen Ping'an breathed a sigh of relief and bade farewell. Glancing at the young boy's disappearing figure, the young man muttered, "He's far too serious, and he's surprisingly not feigning this. Perhaps he's a young pedant taught and raised by some old pedant. Young miss, are you enjoying the scenery by yourself?" a handsome man standing nearby asked. The feminine young man chuckled and replied, "You can get stuffed. I've traveled through a brothel with your mother before." The dignified-looking man hurriedly waved his hand. gesturing for his subordinates to stand down and not act rashly. In the end, he raised a thumb with a dazzling smile, remarking, "I like your personality, young Mississippi." The feminine young man ignored him and left the catch and release pavilion. While walking, he debated whether he should go to the sword reverence pagoda or the incense offering tower first. The dignified-looking man gazed at the stunning beauty with a colorful ribbon around her waist, and he remarked with emotion, "Such carefree and beautiful women only exist in the mountains. Cultivation is good. No matter how beautiful women outside the mountains are, their alluring beauty can only last for a measly 10 or 20 years. Your Majesty, you can head to the Lightning Lake platform now. Don't make the Imperial Preceptor wait for too long." A subordinate reminded him in a soft voice, using the official dialect of Middle-earth Divine Continent. I'll head over right away," the man replied with a smile. Whether it was the man referred to as Your Majesty, or the subordinates beside him, it appeared as if none of them felt like it was right for the Emperor to make his Imperial Preceptor wait. They hurriedly made their way to the Lightning Lake platform. This was a tall platform with 99 steps leading to the top, and it looked like a gigantic bowl that was filled with viscous lightning. According to rumors, the second disciple of the Tao ancestor had scooped up a handful of lightning from that ancient lake of lightning and placed it in Stalactite Mountain. That was a lake of lightning that existed only in the records, but was unable to be found in real life. Every time the branch master, a great heavenly lord, slew an immortal or spirit who had broken the rules, he would detain their souls in the lake of lightning in Stalactite Mountain. However, the Lightning Lake platform was surprisingly closed today, with no one allowed to go near it. At this moment, only a single person with a tall and sturdy body was half-squatting beside the lake of lightning atop the Lightning Lake platform. His elbows rested on his knees, and his chin rested on his arms. A scabbardless sword was hovering amid the lake of lightning, with only less than half of it still visible. After the sword became fully immersed, the entire lake of lightning started to seethe and churn. This person was most likely tempering their sword. An old Taoist priest with a fly whisk resting on his arm stood at the bottom of the tall platform, a warm smile on his face. It was as if he were feeling proud on the tall and sturdy man's behalf. As the third in command in Stalactite Mountain, the old Taoist priest was regarded as a natural enemy by all of the flood dragons and their kin in the South Sea. Throughout a millennium, he had killed countless flood dragons and crafted a pseudo-celestial tool, the fly whisk in his arms. During the most recent 5 centuries, the old Taoist priest had once fought against 2 Confucian sages from southern world continent's Chan clan in the South Sea, and his fame had spread far and wide. However, although he was facing an outsider today, and even if he seemed like a housekeeper for this person, the old Taoist priest didn't feel offended or devalued in the least. Instead, he looked extremely satisfied and pleased with himself. Chan Ping'an came across a very awkward situation. As it turned out, fewer than 1 in 10 people in Stalactite Mountain understood the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Meanwhile, Chan Ping'an couldn't speak or understand the official dialect of Middle-earth Divine Continent. As a result, it was a case of a chicken trying to communicate with ducks as Chan Ping'an asked for directions and kind-hearted passers-by tried to help him out. In the end, Chan Ping'an was forced to bite the bullet and ask over 30 people before finally coming across someone who could understand the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent a little. However, this person didn't know the location of Stork Inn. Chan Ping'an stood on the bustling street, a lost expression on his face as he looked around. He grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and could only drink wine to wash away his gloom. If push came to shove, he could only return to the catch and release dock and ask Lady Gui for Jean Su. He would have to ask this osmanthus girl to act as his guide. As for whether Jean Su would taunt him as an act of revenge, Chan Ping'an didn't care much about this. When it came to face, this was indeed a fairly important consideration between familiar acquaintances. However, how many times would he see someone like Jean Su? A temporary guest in his life? Thus it was okay to be a bit more shameless. No path through the layered mountains and winding rivers. Suddenly I see green willows, bright flowers, and another village. Chan Ping'an managed to nab another passerby who understood the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, but this passerby also didn't know the location of Stork Inn. However, He knew where the Sword Reverence Pagoda and the Ape Havoc Estate were located. When asking him for directions, Chen Ping'an said, "Mister, do you know where the Sword Reverence Pagoda is located?" Surprisingly, the passerby's reply was, "Oh, do you mean the Sword Reverence Pagoda near the Ape Havoc Estate? It's quite easy to get there. It's not too far away from here." Lu Yuzhou, the young boy from pure white continent, wasn't a simple person. And thus, Chen Ping'an directly turned around and returned to the catch and release dock. The passerby's face was filled with slight disappointment as he looked at the young boy's disappearing figure. How good would it have been if he had managed to use this opportunity to forge some relationships with the Ape Havoc Estate? Even showing his face there and being remembered by them would have been a decent outcome. In the end, Jin Su happily disembarked from Osmanthus Island and led the dejected and miserable Chen Ping'an to Stork Inn. Before leaving Osmanthus Island, Lady Gui had given her 3 lesser heat coins and told her to use them sparingly. After entering Stalactite Mountain, Jin Su asked Chen Ping'an whether he wanted to visit the Catch and Release Pavilion. Chen Ping'an told her that he had already visited. Jin Su nodded and said that the Catch and Release Pavilion was the least interesting of the attractions, and it was far inferior to places such as Ganoderma Inn and Milu Cliff. Indeed, he definitely needed to visit the Sword Reverence Pagoda if he wanted to make this trip worthwhile. The two of them walked for almost an hour, and Jin Su spent this time introducing the important scenic locations in Stalactite Mountain to Chen Ping'an. For example, places like Ganoderma Inn. And for example, how the Sword Reverence Pagoda displayed the replica swords of sword cultivators from the Sword Chi Great Wall who had slain upper 5-tier demons before. People could visit and pay homage to these swords. After arriving in Stalactite Mountain, Jin Su was clearly no longer as cold and aloof as she was in Osmanthus Island. Her personality changed drastically, and even though she wasn't exactly gushing without pause, she already seemed no different from ordinary girls her age. She explained that there was a Ganoderma kept in Ganoderma Inn, a rui that had been left in Majestic World by the Tao ancestor. It was filled with spiritual energy, and it transformed the entire Ganoderma Inn into something like a blessed land. Thus, cultivating here would lead to double the results with half the effort. Because of this, Ganoderma Inn was also the most expensive inn on Stalactite Mountain. In fact, even if they did have money, disciples from immortal sects who had come here to train and wealthy descendants from powerful clans who had come here to sightsee found it extremely difficult to reserve a room in Ganoderma Inn. They needed to make reservations several months in advance. When they drew close to Stork Inn, Jin Su lowered her voice and said, "There are also rumors that the Tao ancestor personally planted a gourd vine. 7 of the highest quality sword nurturing gourds were crafted from its fruits, and one of the 7 is kept in a secret room in Ganoderma Inn. Moreover, it's the one crafted from the gourd that ripened first. Right now, it's rumored to be secretly nurturing the flying swords of a dozen or so powerful sword immortals from the Majestic World." When it came to these kinds of rumors and gossip, outsiders would often discuss them with spirit and exuberance. It was as if these outsiders had personally seen the sword nurturing gourds before. Jin Su had heard these rumors from other people, and she was also no exception to this worldly habit. In reality, the Taoist priests from the Taoist second disciples lineage responsible for maintaining the rules in Stalactite Mountain had never mentioned anything about sword nurturing gourds and nurturing flying swords for powerful sword immortals before. They simply stated that no such matter existed in Ganoderma Inn, and it was best that people didn't think about this and spread rumors. Chen Ping'an was reminded of the silver sword nurturing gourd that Aoyang had given to little Baoping. Of course, he also remembered the golden purple sword nurturing gourd that Sun-Scorched Mountain celestial maiden Su Jia had once worn by her waist. In addition to this, there was naturally the so-called old ancestor of sword nurturing gourds that the feminine man had mentioned not long ago. "Miss Jin Su, is the Ape Havoc Estate very famous in Stalactite Mountain?" Chen Ping'an suddenly asked. "Of course," Jin Su replied with a nod. The Ape Havoc Estate owned by Pure White Continent's Lu clan is one of the 4 large private estates in Stalactite Mountain. It sits on a very large piece of land, and it enjoys even greater renown. The Lu clan is the #1 clan in Pure White Continent, and they also have an extremely good reputation there. Almost all of the emperors, rulers, earth immortals, and cultivators in Pure White Continent want to forge a good relationship with the Lu clan. Moreover, we Qi refiners use snowflake coins the most, right? Their appearance is based on the appearance of coins forged by the Liu clan. In fact, the Liu clan owns 10% of the mountain range where the jade mines are located. It doesn't sound like much, but trust me, it's an immense amount. Chen Ping'an was slightly stunned. No wonder Liu Yuzhou had said something like, no matter how little 1 grain rain coin is worth. He genuinely hadn't been bragging. Jin Su's expression was slightly adrift as she continued. Descendants of the Liu clan are truly fortune's children who are born with not just a silver spoon, but a silver mountain. If they want to do something, they can simply throw money at the task. There's nothing in the world that the Liu clan can't afford. Old Dragon City's Sun Jiashu had personally uttered these words to her. At that time Jin Su had caught a hint of yearning in the eyes of Sun Jiashu, this young fortune god. Thus she had a very deep impression of this. Chen Ping'an became increasingly determined not to purposely form bonds with Liu Yuzhou. That young boy was like Osmanthus Island, a colossal intercontinental ship. The roaring waves that he created weren't things that Chen Ping'an could withstand in his current state. Chen Ping'an became slightly despondent upon thinking of this. It was as if wind and snow were pounding down on his heart. How many mountain and water seals could he squander? Right now, he only had a single water seal remaining. Even though there had been tens of thousands of reasons for Chen Ping'an to act as he had done, and he would step forward and make the same choice if faced with the same situation again, the loss of the mountain seal still weighed heavily on Chen Ping'an's mind. He was unable to let this go, not a single bit. However, Chen Ping'an was now able to truly keep these negative emotions to himself now. He was no longer like the young boy from before, the one who had remained downcast and silent for several hundred kilometers after that farewell outside the rundown temple. The big-bearded martial artist and the young Taoist priest had naturally noticed his low spirits, and they had been forced to worry about him the entire time. Stork Inn was located at the end of an alley. The inn manager was a serious and unsmiling young man, and he didn't smile even when he saw Jin Su, who had come here several times. After preparing 2 neighboring rooms for Jin Su and Chen Ping'an, the inn manager paid no more heed to them and left them to their own devices. Jin Su turned to Chen Ping'an and explained in a quiet voice. The inn manager inherited his father's business. Stork Inn used to be very big, and half of the alley used to belong to the inn. It was fairly well renowned in the region around the catch and release dock. However, an unforeseen accident took place, and Osmanthus Island seemingly offered some help as well during that time. However, the inn manager's father still passed away. Things fell into decline, and we're left with what we see now. Chen Ping'an silently committed this to memory. Apart from the dust medicinal shops Zhang Dafeng, all of the shop managers in the world could probably be regarded as good managers. The inns in Stalactite Mountain were no different from the city inns and village inns that Chen Ping'an had stayed in during his travels through the mountains and rivers. They were simply a bit more elegant and clean. Jin Su knocked on Chen Ping'an's door before entering. After sitting down, she started to plan the next 2 days' schedule with Chen Ping'an. She already had a plan in mind, and she suggested that they visit 4 places the next day: the Taoist Seal Hall, the Sword Reverence Pagoda, Ganoderma Inn, and the Taoist Saber Room. They could then visit 3 places the day after: the Incense Offering Tower, Milu Cliff, and the Lightning Lake Platform. The lone peak located in the central region of Stalactite Mountain was a restricted area, so they could only look at it from far away even though they would pass by on their way to the other sightseeing locations. Chen Ping'an asked if there were any shops where he could purchase or sell precious treasures. Jin Su told him that Ganoderma Inn was one such place, and there was also the cloth wrapper shop that had opened on the opposite side of the street to fight for business. Both places dealt with large numbers of treasures and huge sums of money every day, and they only cared about the value of treasures and not the status of their customers. Things were extremely reliable and stable. Due to this fact, many heinous cultivators liked to visit Stalactite Mountain whenever they reaped big rewards. They could flee from pursuit, and they could openly sell their spoils as well. They could obtain money and enjoy life. There were several islands close to Stalactite Mountain, and many righteous cultivators would stay on these islands all year round. They would keep a sharp eye on the situation in Stalactite Mountain, in order to observe the criminals hiding in the mountain. These criminals who were taking advantage of Stalactite Mountain's rules to avoid punishment were all demonic or heretical cultivators, who had the blood of countless people in their hands. These were criminals who had gained infamy in several large continents. Chan Ping'an asked about the exact location where he would leave Stalactite Mountain and enter the Sword Chi Great Wall, and Jin Su was curious about why the young boy was asking this given he would head there in just 3 days' time. However, she still told him that the location was someplace beside the lone peak in the central region of Stalactite Mountain. There was a large door there, one which was a replica of ancient immortal ascending platforms. Those with a jade tablet inscribed with the character border could visit and observe this door. Like the 10th tier of pure martial arts, the 13th tier of Qi refinement, the Ascension tier was considered the N tier. The 2 tiers above this were the 2 lost tiers. During those ancient times when sages had traveled around the world to teach and benefit the masses, there had seemingly been immortal ascending platforms scattered around the world. Qi refiner could easily ascend, and they could ride the clouds, ride dragons, or ride cranes as they enjoyed ascension. Heavenly maidens would scatter flowers in the air, iridescent clouds would decorate the sky with spectacular colors, and brilliant rays of light would shoot through space. All of these peculiar phenomena would appear together to celebrate the ascending cultivator's attainment of the Tao. Cultivators yearned to achieve this. After Chan Ping'an and Jin Su agreed on a time to meet up and leave tomorrow morning, the young boy left the inn by himself and headed to the foot of the Lone Peak. The Lone Peak was where the great heavenly lord was cultivating in seclusion. Chan Ping'an mulled over the 9 different places as he walked: the Catch and Release Pavilion, Sword Reverence Pagoda, Incense Offering Tower, Lightning Lake Platform, Ganoderma Inn, Daoist Seal Hall, Daoist Saber Room, Milu Cliff, and Lone Peak. There were 9 different structures, just like there were 9 different mighty suppressing pagodas. Perhaps this was also a formation used by a sage to hold down fortune. At the foot of the Lone Peak, there was a divine mountain path wide enough to accommodate 3 horse-drawn carriages. Nearby there was also a plaza paved with white jade. There was only a single iron chain fence surrounding the plaza, and the fence was only half a meter tall. Anyone could stride over the fence with a single step. There were 2 large pillars located in the center of the plaza, made of white jade and measuring more than 30 meters in height. Between the 2 pillars, there was a curtain of water that appeared as still as a mirror. Small ripples would occasionally travel over its surface. Few people were on the plaza right now, and there were only 20 or 30 people scattered around. Whether old or young, male or female, everyone had a border jade tablet hanging from their waist. Some mischievous children directly charged through the curtain of water and sprinted around, chasing after their friends and playing boisterously on the plaza. There was no Taoist priest responsible for overlooking the plaza. Chan Ping'an hesitated briefly before carefully stepping over the iron chain fence and entering the plaza. There was no unexpected response, and this allowed him to calm down slightly. He slowly walked toward the 2 large pillars. Chan Ping'an discovered that flowing light would appear under his feet with each step that he took. Looking up, he discovered a young Taoist priest wearing a large Taoist robe sitting on a straw mat beside one of the large pillars. He was reading a book. If little children who looked around the same age as him approached him, the young Taoist robes with a fishtail hat would casually flick his sleeve and send the children floating into the distance. The little children were delighted by this, and they continued to run up to the young Taoist priest again and again. The young Taoist priest didn't seem annoyed by their antics either, and he continued to flick his sleeve again and again. Chan Ping'an didn't dare to emulate the children's wanton acts of charging into the mirror without permission, so he instead walked around a large pillar to go behind the curtain of water. He found that there was another small pillar standing beside the large pillar. This stone pillar looked like a hitching post, and there was a middle-aged swordsman in tattered clothes sitting cross-legged on top of it. There was a sword in his arms, and his eyes were closed as he snoozed. This person was clearly a paramount individual. Chan Ping'an didn't dare to disturb this swordsman's rest, so he subconsciously started to walk in a quieter manner. He was just about to turn around and return to the other side. The sleeping swordsman's head suddenly drooped and jerked back up, causing him to wake with a start. His appearance was rather plain, and he looked left, right, up, and down before finally settling his gaze on the young boy with a sword case on his back. He murmured something to himself. It seemed like 3 words before going back to sleep. Chan Ping'an stood near the curtain of water and dazedly stared at it for a long time. He found it difficult to imagine that the Sword Chi Great Wall actually lay on the other side of this curtain. Another world existed behind this curtain of water? On the lone peak that towered into the clouds, There existed the tallest building on Stalactite Mountain. This building would be hidden by seas of clouds for more than half of the year. There were 3 bell chimes hanging from the eaves on the top floor of the building, and it was rumored that they would only chime in a melodious manner when all 3 branch masters of the Taoist sect visited Stalactite Mountain together. Right now, a great heavenly lord of the Taoist sect was standing on the roof and looking through the clouds, peering down at the plaza beneath the lone peak. The young boy with a sword case on his back was as small as a mustard seed. Chen Ping'an returned to Stork Inn and continued to practice the 6-step walking meditation and sword furnace standing meditation. Finally, late at night, he undressed and lay down in bed with a smile on his face. Early the next morning, when the sun had only just peeked over the horizon, Jin Su came knocking on his door 15 minutes early. Chen Ping'an stopped his silent session of walking meditation and walked over to the door. He left the inn with Jin Su, and they headed to the Taoist Seal Hall together. The Taoist Seal Hall was also known as the Missing One Hall, and this was because it collected and displayed all of the seals in the world except one, the Mountain Seal. The Taoist Seal Hall respected and adhered to an unwritten rule: mountains shouldn't come face to face. After all, Stalactite Mountain was also a mountain seal itself. Chen Ping'an sighed and entered the Taoist Seal Hall with the energetic and high-spirited Jin Su. The Taoist Seal Hall was 3 stories tall, and each floor was extremely large and spacious and divided into many rooms of varying sizes. Thousands of seals were displayed on each floor, and these seals were allowed to hover in rows upon rows of colored glazed display cabinets. Some seals had already developed rich spiritual energy, allowing them to fly around the colored glazed display cabinets and make banging sounds as they crashed into the sides. In fact, there were even spirits born from the condensed spiritual energy of the seals. Some of these spirits courageously stared back at people through the transparent display cabinets. Chen Ping'an spent a long time in a water seal room on the 2nd floor, unwilling to leave. Upon seeing this, Jin Su went to look at other seals by herself. They agreed to meet at the entrance of the Taoist Seal Hall in 2 hours. The water seal that Chen Ping'an was observing possessed spiritual energy that was as light and nimble as mist. This spiritual energy transformed into a small stream that flowed around the seal. Chen Ping'an was now familiar with many ancient seal characters thanks to the authentic death-avoiding book that Li Shixing had thoroughly annotated for him, and he could tell that the characters on the bottom of the seal said, "Silver River flowing down." According to Jin Su, the Taoist Seal Hall only purchased seals and didn't sell seals. They wouldn't sell seals to anyone. There had only been a single occasion in the past when the Taoist Seal Hall had almost broken this rule. That was when the man who was now Pure White Continent's Lu clan leader announced that he was going to purchase an entire level of seals from the Taoist Seal Hall. In the end, the Taoist priest managing the hall had no option but to report this matter to the Great Heavenly Lord cultivating atop the lone peak. The Great Heavenly Lord's reply had been very simple. He had unleashed a burst of sword chi from the building on top of the lone peak, destroying the Ape Havoc Estate's back garden. However, the young man, who wasn't the clan leader yet at the time, had placed his hands on his hips and angrily cursed the old immortal atop the lone peak. His arguments had boiled down to this: "I'm wealthy as heck, so why don't you come again if you're so capable?" And thus, the Great Heavenly Lord had unleashed a torrent of sword chi, severely damaging the large Ape Havoc estate that had been built up and maintained through many generations. The large formation protecting the Ape Havoc estate, one that was supposedly capable of blocking 100 strikes from high-level sword immortals, had also been completely annihilated. Fortunately, not a single person had been hurt. Afterward, a famous exchange had taken place. With a calm and unchanging expression, the young descendant of the Lu clan had turned around and asked the old steward. The Great Heavenly Lord acted in such a domineering and unreasonable manner. Did his actions conform with the rules? The old steward had smiled and replied, "The Great Heavenly Lord is the embodiment of rules in Stalactite Mountain." Following this exchange, the supreme strength of Stalactite Mountain's Great Heavenly Lord and the incredible wealth of Pure White Continent's Lu clan had simultaneously become renowned throughout the world. Afterward, Chen Ping'an didn't walk up to the 3rd floor to look at the seals there. Instead, he directly went downstairs to wait for Jin Su outside the Taoist Seal Hall. Jin Su came out 15 minutes late. When she saw the young boy staring into space on the steps outside the Taoist Seal Hall, she said in an apologetic voice, I'm late because a seal on the third floor birthed a new and extremely mystical spirit. It was very fun, and it was able to take the shape of anyone who locked gazes with it. A lot of people were lining up to give it a go. I'm really sorry about this, Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an stood up and patted his clothes clean. A smile stretched across his face and he replied, "It's not like we're in a hurry or anything." When Jin Su directly said Chen Ping'an's name for the first time in Stalactite Mountain, the two people guarding the door at the foot of the Lone Peak opened their eyes in unison as if in tacit understanding. They were the young Taoist priest and the middle-aged man holding the sword in his arms. The young Taoist priest stood up from his straw mat and left the White Jade Plaza, heading toward the incense offering tower. The middle-aged man holding the sword turned around and bent his fingers, making a slight flicking motion at the mirror-like curtain of water. However, he suddenly smiled and twisted his wrist as if reeling something in. He retracted the message that he had just flicked forth. He continued to nod off. Stalactite Mountain didn't forbid the use of mystical abilities, and the young Taoist priest covered several kilometers in a single stride. In the end, he arrived in front of a building in which purple smoke wafted. He strode inside, and many Taoist priests with fishtail hats bowed and cupped their hands in respect upon seeing the white-skinned little boy. They respectfully referred to him as Granduncle Master, and some even referred to him as Great-Granduncle Master. The young Taoist priest had an indifferent expression, and he never responded to any of these people. After entering the building, he flicked his sleeve and sent several visiting Taoists with different Taoist hats and Taoist robes flying. The visiting Taoists at the middle 5 tiers instantly drifted toward the 2 side walls. They were so terrified that they almost suffered a mental collapse. The young Taoist priest strode forward and claimed the incense offering region for himself. He then retrieved a single stick of incense from the incense tube on the nearby table. There were 4 picture scrolls accepting worship on the incense table. The picture scroll of the Tao ancestor was placed the highest, so high that worshippers might miss it completely if they weren't paying attention. Beneath the picture scroll of the Tao ancestor, there were the picture scrolls of 3 Taoist priests hanging side by side. The Taoist priest in the middle held a peachwood talisman, the one on the left was dressed in a feather cloak and held a Tao sword in his hand, and the one on the right was wearing a lotus flower hat. On the gigantic incense table, there was only a single large censer in which worshippers could place their sticks of incense. According to legends, it was said that if Taoist priests and worshippers sincerely offered incense in the incense offering tower, there was a chance for the Tao ancestor and the 3 pure ones, the branch masters, to detect their offering. When Taoist priests visited Stalactite Mountain, they would almost always visit the incense offering tower to offer 3 sticks of incense first. Of course, Taoist priests from Mount Longhu's Heavenly Master residence definitely wouldn't take a single step into the incense offering tower. The young Taoist priest wearing the fishtail hat bowed 3 times at the branch master wearing the lotus flower hat. After placing the stick of incense in the censer, he closed his eyes and recited some words. After a while, the young Taoist priest faltered before opening his eyes. He felt a bit bored, so he turned around and eventually settled his gaze on a young man who looked like a beautiful woman. He frowned and asked, "As a descendant of Middle-earth Divine Continent's Lu clan, why did you go to the Sword Reverence Pagoda first? Why didn't you come here to offer incense first?" The young woman was unfazed, and he replied with a smile, "We loyally and sincerely honor this paramount branch master as our old ancestor, but this old ancestor has never acknowledged us as his descendants. For the past several thousand years, just how many sticks of incense has the Lu clan offered to this branch master? Yet we still haven't heard a single word from him. Will it make a difference if I offer 1 more stick of incense?" A hint of anger appeared on the young Taoist priest's face and he exclaimed, "You still dare to speak with such impudence?" The young man who had come to offer incense smiled with squinted eyes and said, "Heavenly Lord, you're not a Taoist priest from the same branch as our Lu clan's old ancestor, so why are you so pressed about some outsider's etiquette?" The young Taoist priest humped and said, "Fool who doesn't know what's good for you, get out of here." He flicked his sleeve, and the young man who was even more attractive than beautiful women was immediately sent flying out of the building. He crashed into the street outside the incense offering tower, and he continued to vomit blood as he struggled to sit up. Gazing up at the picture scroll on the right which had remained indifferent toward them for hundreds upon thousands of years, The young man started to roar with laughter. Today, this branch master was still as cold and pitiless as always. The Liu clan had faced dire situations and threats of destruction time and time again in history, yet the person in the picture scroll had never paid any heed to them. The young Taoist priest walked out of the incense offering tower and shot a quick glance at the extremely disheveled young man. He then disappeared in a flash. Following Jin Su's lead, Chen Ping'an arrived at Ganoderma Inn at noon. Here, he was able to see the legendary Ganoderma Rui. After looking through the astronomically expensive immortal treasures and spirit tools at Ganoderma Inn, Chen Ping'an didn't purchase anything, nor did he sell anything from his pocket treasure. He left the inn and set off for the day's final destination, the Taoist Saber Room. The Taoist Saber Room wasn't fascinating because of the scenery it provided, but rather because of the list on one of its walls. All kinds of bounties were listed on the wall, and the subjects of these bounties were peculiar and varied. There were great demons from some island in the South Sea, the ruler of a nation in some continent, the elder of a terrestrial immortal in some immortal clan, some demonic cultivators who were causing chaos in the world, and even a Confucian sage from southern world continent's Chan clan. There were all kinds of people and creatures on the bounty list. The rules of the Taoist Saber Room had been passed down from some unknown time, and anyone was allowed to post a bounty on the wall. However, the poster had to leave the bounty money with the Taoist Saber Room. Otherwise, if one dared to casually post a bounty without leaving any bounty money, one would have to experience the power of the Taoist Saber Room's Tao Saber. There were different branches under the Taoist second disciples' Tao lineage, and one of the branches used the saber as their Tao instrument. This branch had once made a huge name for itself in Middle-earth Divine Continent, and they had enjoyed an equal standing with the Mahis sect's saber-lending cultivators. One group was domineering and one group was mysterious. In Majestic World, there was something even more troublesome than provoking sword cultivators. That was engaging in conflict with Taoist priests who used sabers as their Tao instrument. This was because Taoist saber priests were all extremely resolute individuals. In fact, they could be regarded as cruel and merciless. They were swift and efficient when slaying demons and fiends, and they were equally as merciless and deadly when fighting against qi refiners. Just how bad was the temper of Taoist saber priests? It was said that one time, a powerful Taoist saber priest had come across esteemed Taoist Huangzi from Mount Longhu's heavenly master residence. They had both wanted to slay a supremely powerful sinister demon. So logically speaking, the two of them should have teamed up or fought against the demon without interfering with each other. Otherwise, one of them could have stepped back. However, at the first sign of disagreement, the Taoist saber priest had drawn his saber and pointed it at esteemed Taoist Huangzi. After engaging in an earth-shaking battle and severely wounding the heavenly master, the Taoist saber priest had then gone on to vanquish the sinister demon by himself. This battle had created a huge stir in Golden Armor Continent. In fact, a Taoist ancestor from Middle-earth Divine Continent's heavenly master residence had personally traveled tens of thousands of kilometers to Golden Armor Continent to demand an explanation. In the end, another paramount battle had taken place with the great heavenly lord from the Lone Peak personally stepping forward to fight. He and the heavenly master, who had an extraordinarily high level of seniority, had fought 500 kilometers away from Stalactite Mountain. However, the final outcome remained a complete mystery to outsiders. Of the beautiful women and young ladies who worked as shop attendants in the dust medicinal shop, one was missing today. She was none other than the young girl whom Zheng Dafeng still owed money to. Zheng Dafeng was slightly angry, and he smacked the table and grumbled that the young girl was truly trying to start an uprising. Just because she was beautiful, she was daring to act in such an impudent manner, and this was essentially having no respect for him, their handsome and dashing boss. Because of this, he was going to fine her 30 or 40 copper coins from what he owed her for that book. The grumbling man seemed quite angry. However, it was a shame that none of the women and young girls in the shop took him seriously. They continued to snack on sunflower seeds and chat about trivial matters. In any case, none of them believed that he would truly deduct their wage. After a while, a terrified elder from the Feng clan personally visited the dust medicinal shop with a panicked and apologetic expression on his face. Zheng Dafeng's expression changed slightly, and he immediately stopped his annoying grumbling. He walked around the counter and arrived at the door, saying in a quiet voice, We can speak here. The elder from the Fan clan felt very frustrated. He was someone with genuine influence in the Fan clan's ancestral hall, yet he actually had to come here for the sake of a commoner girl who had nothing to do with the Fan clan. Moreover, the Fan clan hadn't done anything wrong, yet they still needed to apologize to this person. Not only that, but the entire clan was filled with unease, afraid that Zheng Dafeng would take his anger out on them. The old man sighed and said, Mr. Zheng, the young girl who didn't come to the medicine shop today is dead. Zheng Dafeng nodded expressionlessly. The old man misunderstood this response, and he thought that the 10th tier martial artist didn't care much about this matter. He breathed a sigh of relief. Zheng Dafeng waved his hand, signaling that the old man could leave. He then sat down and didn't say anything else. The women and young girls in the medicine shop had sharp senses, and they immediately detected the strange atmosphere at the entrance of the shop. They quickly fell quiet, not daring to speak loudly and certainly not daring to joke around with their boss. Haha, I truly don't need to return the money this time, Zheng Dafeng said. However, there was no hint of joy on his face. He looked toward some shadowy location in the alley and said, I don't trust the Fan clan anymore. I don't trust their character and I don't trust their abilities either. Old Zhao, go and personally investigate this matter. I'm waiting for your news. Zheng Dafeng stood up and patiently waited there just like that. In Old Dragon City, winds of chaos were going to rise from seemingly insignificant duckweed. It was nighttime at Stalactite Mountain. On the plaza, there was the young Taoist priest reading as well as the middle-aged man holding the sword in his arms. Surprisingly, the latter was no longer sleeping now that it was night. Apart from them, the plaza was already completely empty. A gallant-looking young girl with a sword by her waist suddenly stepped out from the curtain of water between the two large pillars. Her eyebrows were like the distant mountains. 1.1. After reading some previous comments, I have to speak up for best girl. This refers to the shape of her eyebrows being gently curved like the distant mountains, not the distance between them being like distant mountains. After visiting the Taoist saber room, Chen Ping'an and Jin Su went to their last destination for the day, the Sword Reverence Pagoda. By following this order, they could cut their time on the road to a minimum and not walk any extra distance today. At the Taoist saber room, the wall was absolutely crammed with bounties. Among these bounties, Chen Ping'an had found 3 familiar names, Chui Chan, Su Ru and Song Chongjing. Chui Chan's name appeared the most, with 6 bounties asking for his head. Moreover, the posters were from 4 different continents. From this, it was abundantly clear just how unpopular the former first disciple of the scholarly sage was in Majestic World. As for the Mahis cultivator Su Rua and the Greatly Empire Song Chongjing, both had a single bounty for their head. However, the reasons for these 2 bounties were very strange. The poster asking for Su Rua's head was a woman who had signed her name as Extraordinary Lakes Greenwater Primordial Lord Lu Roshi. Her words were filled with a sense of hatred as well as a sense of affection. Meanwhile, the person putting a bounty on Song Chongjing had signed off as Golden Armor Continent's Han Wanzhan. Perhaps this person had too much money but nowhere to spend it, as his reason for posting this bounty was that he felt like the small eastern treasured Vile continent wasn't worthy of having a superior martial arts grandmaster at the end tier. When Chen Ping'an and Jin Su turned around to leave, they walked past a group of 3 people on the opposite side of the street. Chen Ping'an couldn't help but take another glance at them. This was because that woman was genuinely far too tall. Her hair was tied into a ponytail, her figure was shapely, and there was a scabbardless sword hanging by her waist. It looked like a newly forged sword and it glowed in the sun with a snow-white glint as the tall woman walked forward. In fact, it wasn't just Chen Ping'an who was taking an extra glance at this woman. Almost without exception, everyone on the street was checking out this strange woman. A handsome man was walking beside her, and the tall woman occasionally nodded as he continued to speak quietly. However, she seldom said anything. There was a middle-aged subordinate behind them, and he was filled with an extremely strong killing intent that was very difficult to conceal. Perhaps he was a pure martial artist under the 7th tier and without a Vajra body yet, so he was unable to conceal his powerful aura. If he was above the 7th tier but still possessed such an aura, however, then that would truly be quite terrifying. Of the myriad sword cultivators in Majestic World, Middle-earth Divine Continent's Wu Yu was the most extreme example of this. Even after walking far away, Jinsu still couldn't help but turn back to glance at the tall woman. The young girl seemed reluctant to see the tall woman disappear. Even though the tall woman hadn't said anything and she wasn't wearing exquisite clothes, and in fact she wasn't a stunning beauty either, Jinsu still felt very envious of this woman. This couldn't be explained clearly. Some people were indeed unique in this sense. A single glance at them and one could remember them for many years. However, there were also some people who were the complete opposite. No matter how many years one looked at them, these people would still fail to find a spot in one's mind. Chen Ping'an didn't pay much attention to this, and it wasn't long before he pushed the woman out of his mind. He took small sips of wine as he recalled the stone arch bridge in his hometown. Of course, thinking of this eventually led him to think about that golden bridge in the sky as well. That was a bridge that spanned endlessly through the sea of clouds. The tall woman never measured anyone with her eyes as she walked. She walked all the way to the spirit wall in the Taoist saber room, where she looked up and rapidly browsed through the bounties on the wall. She was largely uninterested and unwilling to take an extra glance. After a while, her gaze stopped on a bounty placed on the top leftmost corner of the wall. Her eyes lit up. She had traveled south to Stalactite Mountain on the Mirage ship owned by her empire. The ship had traveled from the north of Middle-earth Divine Continent and flown over the Extraordinary Lake, one of the 5 famous lakes. It had passed Tassel Mountain, the tallest mountain in the world, and it had also journeyed through Southern World Continent. However, the woman had stayed inside her room the entire time, reading an ancient book from some fallen empire. She had never showed her face, yet her lack of activity made her want to do something now. After tempering her sword in Stalactite Mountain, she wanted to find something to do when returning north. She reached out and grabbed a bounty from the wall before turning to the front door of the Taoist saber room and announcing in an indifferent voice, "I'll be accepting this bounty." The handsome man had been following the tall woman's gaze just then, and he had been muttering something under his breath the entire time. Upon seeing her gaze settle on that certain bounty, he had quietly prayed, "Don't grab that one, don't grab that one, you can grab anything apart from that one." However, his prayers had gone unheard, and the tall woman had grabbed exactly that bounty. That was an old bounty that had been stuck on the wall for heaven knew how many years. The Grandmaster tier subordinate behind them had a wide smile. He was completely unsurprised, and he had anticipated this outcome from the very beginning. There was a sullen expression on the handsome man's face as he asked, "Imperial Preceptor, are we truly going to travel to White Emperor City to stir trouble? The paramount demonic cultivator near our place is only a few ranking spots below White Emperor City's city lord. Isn't he? He's also one of the 10 most powerful demonic cultivators in Majestic World, so why don't you look for him? That will be a quick and easy task, and I might have just finished preparing a pot of wine for you when you return." Of course, this demonic cultivator has already gone into seclusion due to his fear of you. News has even spread of his desire to relocate his sect. The tall woman smiled and cut the handsome man off, saying, "I was only able to advance my cultivation base thanks to that person's immense help. I forgot to tell you, Your Majesty, but I've already killed him." The man faltered for a moment before saying in pity, "Imperial Preceptor, why didn't you persuade him to surrender? If we gained such a powerful helper." The tall woman smiled again, replying, "I did try to persuade him. However, he put forward one condition, and that was for me to become his mistress. I thought about it for a bit, and I eventually decided that it would be easier to kill him than to act as his maidservant and serve tea." The handsome man sighed in a forlorn manner. However, he quickly came to his senses, and he beat his chest and stomped his feet as he exclaimed, "Imperial Preceptor, tell it to me straight. Did he say these words before or after the fight?" The tall woman felt slightly guilty, and she patted the handsome man's shoulder as she smiled and said, "Your wisdom is truly unmatched, Your Majesty." At that time she hadn't accepted the demonic cultivator's apology, as he had kneeled on the ground and kowtowed while begging for mercy. After leaving the corpse-strewn demonic sect in the mountains, she had ridden through small mountain paths on a galloping horse with the head of the demonic cultivator still impaled on the tip of her spear. She had initially planned to bring it back to the palace to show the emperor. He was always thinking and talking about this paramount demonic cultivator after all, so she could finally show him what this demonic cultivator looked like. However, upon realizing that the emperor would most likely grumble about her not taking into consideration the bigger picture, she had flicked her wrist and tossed the head away. Afterward, she had acted as if nothing had happened at all. Because of this, she felt slightly guilty and apologetic toward the emperor beside her. After all, this was an emperor who needed to ask for her opinion on everything, whether that be establishing or abolishing his empress, deciding on a crown prince, choosing a location for his tomb, and so on. It was very difficult to find such an emperor in Majestic World. She needed to cherish this. The handsome man became a bit numb from pain, and he said in a listless manner, "Then I'll get someone to deliver a message to the capital straight away. I'll tell them to bring that suit of armor over for you. The city lord of White Emperor City is far too strong, so you can't be careless." However, the tall woman suddenly shook her head and said with a fervent look in her eyes, "If I engage in an intense life-and-death battle with the city lord from White Emperor City, then wearing that suit of armor or not won't make any difference at all. There's no need to do something unnecessary, Your Majesty. I've begged you many times already, but I'll beg you one more time now," the man said in a solemn voice. "Don't fight to the death and just fight until a victor is decided, okay? After your battle, you can view the iridescent clouds with the city lord, play a few games of Go with him, and take a stroll by the river." The tall woman glanced at her emperor and chuckled. "Your Majesty, perhaps you're wishing for the city lord of White Emperor City to join our empire one day?" The handsome man raised his thumb and shamelessly said, "As expected, you always have the most comprehensive plans and understanding. In my life, I'll only marry the Marshal Dao and no one else," the tall woman stated calmly. The handsome man sighed and didn't say anything else. When the tall woman grabbed the bounty from the wall, no one from the Taoist saber room came forward to greet her and interact with her. Meanwhile, all of the chi refiners crowding around the spirit wall scattered like frightened birds and beasts. The newest ranking list for the top 10 cultivators was compiled by Middle-earth Divine Continent, and the cultivators on the list were all individuals from the mountain peaks who had appeared in the world and displayed their power sometime during the past 100 years. Otherwise, they would be excluded from the list. The previous list had consisted entirely of chi refiners at the upper 5 tiers, for example, heavenly masters from Mount Longhu. Now, however, they only occupied 9 of the 10 spots. This was the first time in the history of Majestic World that a pure martial artist had made it onto the list. Not only that, but this pure martial artist was a female martial goddess, and she had charged into the top 5 in a single go. In the 4th spot was none other than the city lord of White Emperor City. The tall woman turned around and said to the subordinate behind them, "You can travel to Eastern Treasured Vile Continent in my stead. If those people stubbornly refuse to hand that sword scabbard over, then just let it be. You don't need to force them against their will." The middle-aged subordinate nodded in understanding. Before entering the Sword Reverence Pagoda, both Chun Ping'an and Jin Su had their own individual thoughts and plans. Chun Ping'an wanted to see whether the sword of that man with the bamboo hat was displayed in the Sword Reverence Pagoda. If it was, then what would its name be? Just how many great demons at the upper 5 tiers had it slain? Meanwhile, Jin Su wanted to pay homage to the swords of those female sword immortals. They both had their own plans, so they decided to split up and each go their own way. The Sword Reverence Pagoda was split into 2 floors, with the replica swords displayed on the 2nd floor not open to visitors. However, the 1st floor stretched for quite a long way, and this was because of how the replica swords were organized. They were displayed in rooms categorized by millennia, and each room would display the replica swords of those who had slain great demons during that 1,000-year period. Thus, each room had a different number of swords. However, not a single room was empty, with the only difference being how many or how very many swords there were. Chun Ping'an walked through the rooms and looked at the swords, remembering all of their ancient names. In the end, he came to a conclusion. The 2nd floor most likely had a secret display of the picture scrolls and replica swords of those who had engraved characters on the Sword Chi Great Wall. The displays in the Sword Reverence Pagoda were extremely well put together, with each replica sword placed on a unique sword stand. Not only that, but there were also picture scrolls of sword immortals hanging behind them, each measuring half a person tall. These were lifelike portraits of their owners. In reality, it wasn't exactly accurate to call these picture scrolls. This was because they were formed from white mist that provided an incredible level of detail. It was as if the sword immortals were still alive. Even though there was a larger number of replica swords from male sword immortals, Qian Ping'an still looked through the displays faster than Jin Su. However, they coincidentally came across each other in the last room. In an even greater coincidence, they stood next to each other at almost the exact same moment. One looked at the male sword immortal's sword, Dogwood Cherry, and his expression changed slightly. The other gazed at the female sword immortal's sword, Restful Bamboo Grove, and a complicated look appeared in her eyes. Most importantly, neither the male sword immortal nor the female sword immortal had a picture scroll. Someone suddenly pushed Qian Ping'an aside, cursing loudly as they did so. Even though Qian Ping'an didn't understand which continent this person's official dialect was from, he could easily tell that this person was very angry. The person spat at the sword stands and replica swords, and he was clearly irritated at Qian Ping'an as well, especially since the young boy was standing there without moving. He continued to rattle on in a dialect that Qian Ping'an didn't understand at all. After a while, the person also seemed to realize that the young boy with the sword case couldn't understand him. He huffed and left in anger. "Let's go," Jin Su said with a sigh. While standing outside the bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain, Qian Ping'an had heard Wei Bo talk about these past events. To say nothing of the current battle situation where the demon tribe was attacking the Sword Qi Great Wall, those events of the past had truly been epic. There had been several tense battles to decide the ownership of the Sword Qi Great Wall, and the demon tribe had eventually returned many damaged flying swords to the humans. However, a male sword immortal and a female sword immortal had perished during those 13 battles. It was incredibly tragic. Both were meritorious and supremely powerful sword immortals, yet they had actually been killed in battle by great demons in front of everyone else. Both killed in battle. Qian Ping'an looked at the name of the male sword immortal before turning his head to glance at the name of the female sword immortal. "Qian Ping'an, you're not leaving yet?" Jin Su asked with a puzzled expression. You can return to the inn. I want to look through the Sword Reverence Pagoda again. This place is open all day," Qian Ping'an replied. "Do you remember the way back?" Jin Su asked. Qian Ping'an didn't look up and he replied with a nod. "Yes, I remember." Jin Su found this slightly strange, but she simply dismissed it as the young boy who always carried the sword case on his back being unwilling to leave because he was overly eager and interested in the sword immortals from that world. She exited the room, and as she walked past the previous rooms, it was as if time were flowing in reverse for thousands upon thousands of years. There were many visitors from other nations and continents in the Sword Reverence Pagoda, and most of them were polite and respectful as they admired the replica swords. Even though the young boy with the sword case remained standing in front of Dogwood Cherry the entire time, most people didn't complain or say anything. However, there were also people who had very bad tempers like the person from before. Facing Dogwood Cherry and Restful Bamboo Grove, two swords that had slain 11 great demons at the upper 5 tiers before, these people either sneered in disdain or spoke in ridicule. Indeed, some of them directly spat at the sword stands or replica swords. Qian Ping'an didn't understand what they were saying. However, he could sense their fury, ridicule, indifference, mockery, gloating, amusement, and so on. Qian Ping'an didn't kind of feeling. It reminded him of his experience on Osmanthus Island back then. It was as if only hostility remained in the world. One time, Qian Ping'an was knocked over by a tall and burly man. The man strode forward and was just about to destroy the sword stand with a single punch. However, a middle-aged Taoist nun with a fishtail hat suddenly appeared in front of him, warning with a smile. Damaging the collection of the Sword Reverence Pagoda is strictly prohibited. Violators will be responsible for the consequences. The burly man huffed and retracted his fist, asking, "Then can I spit at it? Will that break the rules of Stalactite Mountain?" The Taoist nun smiled and remained silent. The burly man understood her implied response, and he spat a mouthful of thick phlegm at the sword stand before turning around to leave. Some people nearby clapped and cheered, and this made the burly man feel an increasing sense of heroism. He felt as if he had done something to everybody's satisfaction. Qian Ping'an still couldn't understand their words. He silently walked to a corner of the room, squatting down and drinking wine. Only when there were few guests in the room would he quickly stand up and walk over to wipe away the spit on Dogwood Cherry and Restful Bamboo Grove, as well as their sword stands. After cleaning them, he would return to the corner of the room to drink. After a while, some people mistook the young boy with the sword case for being an errand boy in the sword reverence pagoda. He was seemingly responsible for looking after this room and preventing the replica swords of those two sinners of the Sword Chi Great Wall from being destroyed. Chen Ping'an stayed in this room of the sword reverence pagoda all the way until night. There were fewer and fewer visitors, so he also stood up fewer and fewer times. Late at night, it had already been an entire hour since the last visitor had come to the room. Only then did Chen Ping'an leave the sword reverence pagoda. He sat on the steps outside and held the sword nurturing gourd in his hand. However, he didn't drink anymore, and his lips were tightly pursed. The surname of the male sword immortal was Ning. The surname of the female sword immortal was Yao. Once upon a time, a young girl had introduced herself to Chen Ping'an as such. "Hello, my name is Ning Yao. My name comes from my father and mother's surnames, which are Ning and Yao respectively." While fighting against the mountain-moving ape from Sun-Scorched Mountain, the young girl's words had clearly indicated that her parents were still healthy and alive. Moreover, during her entire stay in Jewel Small World, she had never acted like someone who had lost her parents. Thus, even when Wei Bo stood in Downtrodden Mountain and mentioned the death of a couple at the Sword Chi Great Wall, Chen Ping'an never linked this tragedy with the young girl. However, looking back now, there had already been many clues and hints. She didn't like talking about the character badass on the Sword Chi Great Wall. She said that her partner had to be the strongest sword immortal in the world. Not one of the strongest, but the strongest. She had traveled around Majestic World by her lone self since a very young age, looking for someone to forge a good sword for her. Chen Ping'an sat on the steps and wrapped his arms around his knees. Resting in the sword case on his back were subduing demons and eliminating fiends, two swords that he had named. Inside his sword nurturing gourd were two more flying swords, 1st and 15th. There was also a pair of straw sandals on his feet. Chen Ping'an sat with his back facing the sword reverence pagoda, inside which Dogwood Cherry and Restful Bamboo Grove were still standing side by side in the innermost display room. Chen Ping'an sat on the steps and stared blankly into space for a long time, his eyes completely expressionless. However, he suddenly came to his senses and discovered a young girl standing not far in front of him. The young girl furrowed her brows slightly and directly said, "Chen Ping'an, why was the letter delivered to my home written by Ruan Xiu and not you? What's going on with you?" It was as if Chen Ping'an had been struck by lightning, and his reply was completely unrelated to the question. "Long time no see, Ning Yao." Ning Yao sighed as she looked at Chen Ping'an's silly expression. She felt slightly exasperated, and she sat down beside him before huffing, "Long time no see? Just how long has it been?" Chen Ping'an thought for a moment and he scratched his head. For some reason he felt like it had already been a very long time. He had walked hundreds upon thousands of kilometers. He had thrown over 1,000,000 punches. Ning Yao looked at the young boy who was sitting upright, and she glanced at the sword case on his back. She suddenly chuckled and couldn't help but say, "Chen Ping'an, you're a." However, Ning Yao was mystified to discover that the young fool, who was always fearless about everything, was sweating profusely in fear before she could even finish her sentence. 1. Referencing a where Chen Ping'an is told that a relationship will be impossible if a girl says, "You're a good person." Before Ning Yao could finish speaking, Chen Ping'an hurriedly told her to hang on for a moment. He then turned around and grabbed his wine gourd, drinking a quick sip of wine. Ning Yao was rather baffled. Perhaps Chen Ping'an had done something bad behind her back? For example, maybe he had accumulated a massive debt while traveling from Jewel Small World to Stalactite Mountain, and he had recorded all of this debt under her name? Or maybe after throwing a few thousand punches, he had felt like fist techniques were pointless, so he had abandoned the mountain shaking guide long ago? And it was because of this that he was carrying a sword case now? Yet, after starting to practice the sword, he had found that both his fist technique and sword skills were unimpressive? Or maybe Chen Ping'an was a lucky idiot, and he had gathered himself a big group of lovers and soulmates while traveling through the cultivation world? And perhaps these lovers and soulmates were waiting for him in an inn right now? Ning Yao's mind wandered all over the place. However, she never considered the possibility that Chen Ping'an might have lost the sword forged by Ruan Xiong. After all, how was this possible? Regardless of how distant the journey was, and no matter what the season was, Chen Ping'an would definitely deliver the sword to her. After drinking a sip of wine, Chen Ping'an suddenly stood up and walked down the steps. He turned around to face Ning Yao as she stood in front of the Sword Reverence Pagoda. A pagoda which seemed to house the tens of thousands of years of spirit and vigor of the Sword Qi Great Wall. Moreover, the sword's dogwood cherry and restful bamboo grove were also displayed inside the pagoda. While squatting in the corner of that display room just then, Chen Ping'an had thought about all kinds of random things. For example, some beautiful lines of poetry. These lines included, "Missing is one as each adorns their hair with dogwood one, sitting alone in the bamboo groves," and so on. He also thought about Aoyang and the character Badass. And he thought about the characters Thunderpool Restricted Land, that were even more ancient and historical. In fact, Chen Ping'an had even daydreamed about what their reunion would be like. Indeed, it definitely wouldn't be, where he was stupidly sitting on a set of steps on Stalactite Mountain and she suddenly appeared in front of him. Ning Yao slowly sat down on the stairs, then leaned back and lazily rested her elbows against the taller steps behind her. She squinted her eyes, making her slender eyebrows appear even more beautiful. Upon seeing this, Chen Ping'an was surprisingly rendered speechless. He turned around and took another sip of wine. Just as he was finally about to say something, Ning Yao raised an eyebrow and sat up straight, asking, "Chen Ping'an, when did you become a drunkard?" The young boy had finally summoned some courage with much difficulty, and a few words had finally crept to the tip of the tongue as if finally making their way up a steep mountain. However, he couldn't help but swallow all of this again. And it was as if his courage and words had plummeted down a cliff and smashed into smithereens. Chen Ping'an sighed in grief and squatted down on the ground, not speaking a word as he scratched his head with both hands. Ning Yao stood up and remarked with a smile, "Chen Ping'an, it seems like you've grown taller?" Chen Ping'an suddenly stood up and gestured for Ning Yao to stay on the set of stairs for a moment. "Ning Yao, let me say something first." The young boy raised his head and straightened his back, tightening his wine gourd around his waist as he gazed at the young girl dressed in a dark green robe. Ning Yao blinked in response, and she was seemingly unable to guess what Chen Ping'an was playing at right now.
Miss Ning.
Chen Ping'an started. However, he suddenly shook his head and corrected himself, saying, "Ning Yao, I like you." Ning Yao sat back down on the steps and replied, "If you're capable, then say it louder." Chen Ping'an raised his voice and shouted, "Ning Yao, I like you." "Who are you?" Ning Yao asked. There was a radiant smile on Chen Ping'an's face, and he was no longer reserved as he proudly announced, "Chen Ping'an from the Great Li Empire's Dragon Spring Prefecture." Chen Ping'an was aware of the safest option. He should have given the sword to Ning Yao and interacted with her for a while first, after which it was best for him to visit her hometown and become acquainted with her friends from the Sword Qi Great Wall. After doing all this, he could decide whether he still wanted to confess to her. In the worst-case scenario, his feelings would be one-sided, but they could perhaps still remain good friends in the future. However, Chen Ping'an wasn't willing to do this. Ning Yao stood up again, and there was a strange look on her face as she asked the young boy, "Is it very impressive to like someone?" Chen Ping'an was at a complete loss. He didn't know how to answer this question. After being confessed to, did all girls in the world ask some question? Chen Ping'an couldn't help but grumble in his mind. Sword Saint Song from Watercombing Nation had jinxed things for him, and the old boatman's master had refused to share his experience with him during their interaction on Osmanthus Island. Ning Yao walked down the steps in a single stride, extending her hand as she arrived in front of Chen Ping'an. "Hand it over." Chen Ping'an nodded in reply and untied the wooden sword case from his back. He then retrieved the sword forged by Sage Ruan Qiong and handed it to Ning Yao standing in front of him. Ning Yao accepted the sword, but she didn't draw the blade from the scabbard to inspect its edge. She tied the sword to her waist and walked forward, brushing past Chen Ping'an just like that. When Chen Ping'an vigorously turned his head around to look at her, he simply saw her raise an arm and lightly wave farewell. His lips moved slightly, yet he was unable to utter a single word. This was because he had expended all of his courage on the confession just then. He stayed like that for a long time, unwilling to turn his head back around, and unwilling to retract his gaze. She walked further and further away, with her figure gradually vanishing into the darkness of night. Chen Ping'an turned around and walked toward the step that he had been sitting on just then. He started to murmur to himself, saying those words that he had been unable to say just then. "Ning Yao, how have you been?" Ningyao, I experienced so many interesting things during my journey. Do you want to hear some stories? Ningyao, you definitely didn't expect this, did you? I promised you that I would practice the fist technique 1,000,000 times, and I'm only 20,000 punches from reaching that goal now. Ningyao, do you know? When you were staying at my place in Clay Vase Alley, your smile made me feel like the richest person in the world. Ningyao, I saw Aoyang, but Mr. Qi has already left. Ningyao, I visited Yellow Court Nation, Great Sway Nation, Colorful Garment Nation, Watercombing Nation, Old Dragon City, and many other places. I came across many girls, but none of them are as beautiful as you. Ningyao, you asked me if I liked you before, and I told you that I didn't. You didn't seem unhappy back then. But I like you very much now, yet you seem unhappy about my confession.
I'm sorry, Ningyao.
Ningyao, I'm so happy that we met. On the White Jade Plaza beneath Lone Peak, a young Taoist priest with a fishtail hat continued to read while sitting on his straw mat. These few days were important fasting days for Heavenly World, and Stalactite Mountain never considered itself part of Majestic World. Thus, this large gate leading to the Sword Chi Great Wall would only reopen at midnight in 2 days' time. Otherwise, this plaza should have been one of the busiest areas in Stalactite Mountain. This was because this gate only allowed people through, not cargo. The true transit hub was located on the inside of Stalactite Mountain, including the docks near the Catch and Release Pavilion and the Incense Offering Tower. All of the 8 docks had a path leading diagonally downward toward the inside of the mountain. In the past, the 2 sect brothers had argued about whether they needed to dig a tunnel through the mountain and build a new dock on the inside. They had also clashed about whether they needed to ask for instructions from that branch master in Heavenly World. The great Heavenly Lord in Stalactite Mountain had argued that this was the unstoppable momentum of the world, so why should Stalactite Mountain not take advantage of this potential incense money? Apart from being a gatekeeper, the young Taoist priest was also the second in command in Stalactite Mountain. He had held a different opinion, arguing that any works on Stalactite Mountain that pertained to the body of the mountain seal, no matter how minor, would be an act of extreme disrespect toward their master. At the time, the 2 of them had failed to reach a consensus and had even gotten into a huge fight. Afterward, they had both offered 3 sticks of incense at the Incense Offering Tower, catching the attention of the branch master who stayed in the heavens beyond heavens all year round. The branch master, their teacher, had returned to the Heavenly World's White Jade capital. Then, he had personally issued a decree. Only after this had the 2 sect brothers finally stopped their conflict. However, following the conclusion of this matter, the young Taoist priest who had possessed influence and power rivaling his senior brother in Stalactite Mountain had stopped caring about all the affairs of Stalactite Mountain in anger. He left everything to the great Heavenly Lord, and he simply guarded his own straw mat. The man hugging the sword in his arms had been sitting on the hitching post sleeping for the entire day, yet he was surprisingly awake and alert at night, with his eyes as bright as the radiant moon. There was an amused smile on his face as if he were watching an interesting show, and he kept glancing around the plaza as if he were waiting for someone. After waiting for a long time, the expected person still didn't arrive. He became a little impatient, and he hopped down the hitching post and made his way around the mirror-like gate. He squatted down beside the young Taoist priest, and all he heard was the slow and intermittent sound of the young Taoist priest flipping pages. The young Taoist priest had been in a terrible mood lately. Even though he belonged to the same branch as the great Heavenly Lord, he had a very close relationship with 3rd Branch Master Lu Chan. Recently, however, he would feel annoyed whenever he saw that sissy with the surname Lu. The sissy's arrogant tone was even more annoying. His senior brother losing a fight to someone was also very annoying. Why were there so many annoying matters in the world? Before being tricked to Stalactite Mountain by Branch Master Lu Chan, the young Taoist priest had never experienced so many annoying matters in White Jade capital. He would accompany Branch Master Lu Chan for a stroll around the top floor of some building every day, and he would eagerly wait for his master to return from the heavens beyond heavens to take a rest in White Jade capital. If he was lucky, he could even come across the Tao ancestor who could barely be seen once a century. The Tao ancestor was a very busy person, so he seldom ever appeared in White Jade capital. He was either traveling around some unknown mystical realm to stabilize its fortunes and transform it into a small world suitable for living and cultivation, or he was observing the Tao in that lotus flower world. There was naturally no need for the Tao ancestor to comprehend the Tao anymore. So his act of so-called observing the Tao merely involved him observing the minor Tao of other people, according to the explanation provided by the young Taoist priest's master. The young Taoist priest couldn't stand the sword-hugging middle-aged man beside him, so he huffed, "At the end of the day, she's still nothing more than a young girl." "What's so interesting?" "You don't understand," the sword-hugging middle-aged man replied with a smile. "I'm here as a punishment, so it's very rare for me to find anything a little interesting." The young Taoist priest closed his book and chuckled. "Oh? There's only a single gate in your way, and you're also a great sword immortal at the immortal tier here in Majestic World. A little interesting? How little?" The middle-aged man shook his head and sighed. "It's truly boring to chat with someone like you." After saying this, he added, "The pair of gatekeepers next door get along better than us. Would you look? They're already starting to make small bets for entertainment." The young Taoist priest finally became a little interested and he asked, "What are they betting on?" "Lend me half of your straw mat to sit on," the sword-hugging middle-aged man asked in a tentative manner. The young Taoist priest remained unmoving, and he smiled coldly and replied, "What do you think?" The middle-aged man didn't dwell on this and he continued, "Old Yao next door is making a bet with that Taoist nun who has a saber. They're betting on whether the young girl will return to the Sword Chi Great Wall by herself, or with someone beside her when morning comes." "Why isn't there an option for neither of them returning?" the young Taoist priest asked. The sword-hugging middle-aged man shook his head and gazed into the distance, replying, "She'll definitely return to the Sword Chi Great Wall." "Due to the glory of the Ning clan and the Yao clan?" the young Taoist priest asked. The middle-aged man sighed in response, a complicated expression on his face. The eyes of the young Taoist priest lit up, and he casually flicked his sleeve and silently recited two names in his mind using the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Two azure-colored talismans were casually created, and they both disappeared in a flash. The sword-hugging middle-aged man snapped his fingers and shattered the two talismans that were even more indiscernible than slightly azure smoke. "One should not look at that which is contrary to propriety, and one should not listen to that which is contrary to propriety," he said with a huff. The two talismans included a heaven and earth echoing talisman and a refreshing breeze talisman. The former could rapidly travel around heaven and earth, and it would immediately activate when it encountered the characters silently recited by its creator. It would secretly record the contents of the conversation. Meanwhile, the latter could find the people illustrated on the talisman, after which it could record and stream the images to its creator. Both talismans were extremely high quality and incredibly difficult to draw. In the mountains, however, these were considered some of the more useless Taoist talismans. This was because both the echoing talisman and the refreshing breeze talisman would rapidly lose their spiritual energy upon coming into contact with restrictions or murderous auras. For example, when they came across the images of door gods, Wenchong pavilions, martial sage temples, unmarked graveyards, and so on. Even if high-quality talisman paper was used, these talismans would still create quite some commotion when losing their spiritual energy. This would betray their presence, and the targeted cultivators would naturally view this as an act of provocation. Following the hints and traces, it would be very easy for the targeted cultivators to find the talisman's creator and thus start a conflict. Because of this, such kinds of talismans were only suitable for investigative purposes in lands with no Tao. Of course, it was naturally fine for the young Taoist priest to use the two talismans in Stalactite Mountain, his own territory. However, it was a shame that the sword immortal beside him had destroyed them with a snap of his fingers. "Do you want to make a bet?" the sword-hugging middle-aged man asked. The young Taoist priest was completely uninterested, and he shook his head and replied, "No, you're a gambling addict with a terrible reputation. In fact, you rank in the top 3 shameless gamblers in Stalactite Mountain. If I lose a bet to you, I'll definitely pay you the wagered amount. If I win the bet against you, however, I definitely won't be able to receive anything. What's the point of making a bet? No thanks." The middle-aged man put on a melancholy expression as he lamented, "There's nothing for me to look forward to anymore. As a gambling addict, I can't even be the #1 shameless gambler." The young Taoist priest recalled something interesting and he chuckled, "You're already in a fortunate position. Just take a look at those two sword replicas in the Sword Reverence Pagoda before taking a look at yourself. Regardless of whether they're from the Sword Chi Great Wall or Majestic World, everyone who passes here shows you utmost respect, do they not? As a great sword immortal, even your fart is fragrant in their eyes. The middle-aged man wasn't angered, and there was self-ridicule in his voice as he said, "If that's the case, then I indeed shouldn't complain about having to guard the gate here." The young Taoist priest put his book down and placed his hands behind his head, looking up at the sky. To common people in the mortal world, their hometown will most likely become a past home after they leave for 100 years, the middle-aged man murmured. To Chi refiners, perhaps this will stretch out to 1,000 years. Then what about us, convicts and refugees who have left home for more than 10,000 years? The young Taoist priest didn't answer this question. He couldn't answer this question. It was late at night in Stalactite Mountain, yet a scorching sun still hung high above the gate. There were also two people guarding this gate, and they were also from the Sword Chi Great Wall and Stalactite Mountain respectively. An old sword cultivator in gray was openly refining his bonded flying sword, and standing beside him was a middle-aged Taoist nun with a Tao saber by her waist. The Taoist nun furrowed her brows and said, "It's not right for little Ning to secretly go to Stalactite Mountain by herself. When the great heavenly Lord questions us about this, I'll tell him the truth." The old sword cultivator nodded and replied, "Yes, tell him the truth. I'll take responsibility." A group of young boys and young girls walked over from the distance, and they were all extremely famous individuals in the Sword Chi Great Wall. Even though they all had powerful backgrounds and were regarded as great prodigies, these children had still been deployed 3 times in under 3 years because of the recent battle. They had lost 2 members, with a young boy with the nickname Little Grasshopper losing his life on the battlefield to the south of the wall, and 1 member returning to a Confucian school after completing their training. There was a handsome young boy with 2 swords by his waist. One had a scabbard scripture and one was without a scabbard cloud pattern. There was a chubby young boy who always had a smile on his face. However, he also radiated the strongest killing intent. A sword named Purple Lightning hung by his waist. There was a single-armed young girl, and she was carrying a disproportionately large sword on her back, mountain suppressing. There was an ugly and tanned young boy whose face was riddled with scars, yet his sword was one called Elaborate Makeup. The old sword cultivator didn't seem happy to see these young children, and he continued to focus on practicing his sword techniques. Instead, it was the Taoist saber nun who had no historical relationship with the large clans in the Sword Chi Great Wall that offered a sincere smile and greeted the children. She said they were still children, but they were only children in stature and age. In reality, almost everyone in the Sword Chi Great Wall could foresee their impressive future path and their lofty future achievements. This was especially the case after they crossed the city wall and traveled south to the battlefield, personally taking part in those bloody battles. Indeed, they had already won enough respect. In the Sword Chi Great Wall, no one cared about your surname. Everyone had to prove themselves on the battlefield. Of course, there were still some minor differences, reflected in the cultivation base of the sword cultivators who guarded the young sword cultivators. When it came to young sword cultivators from poor families, they could only rely on sword cultivators organized by the Sword Chi Great Wall. However, when descendants from the large clans first entered the battlefield, they would definitely enjoy secret protection from powerful subordinates who were temporarily without other missions. Of course, these subordinates definitely wouldn't interfere unless the young descendants were facing certain death. To the north of the Sword Chi Great Wall, every inch of the land was completely infused with sword chi that had been passed down through the generations. To the south, every inch of the land was completely soaked in the blood of their ancestors. The youths all had unique personalities, and the chubby young boy kept pestering the Taoist saber nun, attempting to speak in an awkwardly uncouth manner like a certain someone. However, he ended up being labeled a stupid goose by the Taoist nun from Stalactite Mountain. Meanwhile, the single-armed young girl kept staring at the sword techniques of the old sword cultivator. There was displeasure on the face of the handsome young boy, and the tanned young boy numbly looked at the large gate. He had heard that another world lay beyond this nearby gate. Moreover, there was only a single sun and moon there, and there were also beautiful mountains and limpid waters. The young boy couldn't fathom the concept of beautiful mountains and limpid waters. The handsome young boy continued to smack the hilts of his swords with his palms, appearing slightly impatient as he grumbled. If I see that person, I'm afraid that I won't be able to stop myself from swinging my sword at him. You guys definitely have to stop me at that time. The chubby young boy chuckled and replied, Why should we stop you? It's best that you hack him to death. Afterward, you'll also be chopped into mincemeat by Ning Yao. That way we'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone and eliminate 2 eyesores at once. Rest assured, I'll look after scripture and cloud pattern for you. After joking around, the chubby young boy appeared slightly helpless as he continued. Ning Yao isn't willing to say anything about that person, and she keeps repeating the same reply again and again. An idiot from Jewel's small world, a foolishly kind person, and an absolute miser. Why do I feel like if we were forced to make a choice, that bookworm from the Confucian school is slightly more likable? At the very least, he's fought alongside us several times, and he even saved Charcoal Dong that one time. He's just barely worthy of Ning Yao. The ugly young boy shot a ferocious glare at the chubby young boy. The latter was completely unafraid, and he responded by making eyes at the ugly young boy. Maybe we're overthinking things? The handsome young boy speculated. With Ning Yao's personality, will she ever be attracted to anyone? The single-armed young girl carefully pondered this for a moment. She cherished her words like gold and she concluded, Tough. In the second half of the night in Stalactite Mountain, a gallant-looking young girl dressed in dark green and with twin swords on her waist appeared near the foot of Lone Peak. She didn't so much as glance at the sword-hugging middle-aged man and the young Taoist priest as she directly walked into the mirror-like gate. In just an instant, she walked out from the mirror-like gate again, welcomed by the scorching sun in the sky. She looked up and instinctively squinted her eyes. Inside and outside the large gate, the sword-hugging middle-aged man and the young Taoist priest, as well as the old sword cultivator in gray and the Taoist saber nun, all exchanged a glance as if in tacit understanding. As for the group of youths who were the same age as her, friends who deeply respected and revered her, they all breathed a sigh of relief in a very heartless manner. Seeing Ning Yao return to the Sword Chi Great Wall by herself, they felt like the weather today was truly quite good. They walked for a while, and the tanned young boy called Charcoal Dong eventually turned around and asked, Big Sister Ning? Ning Yao nodded in response before picking up her pace to catch up with the others. She then overtook them. Initially talking and laughing, the group of 4 young children quickly fell silent. Outside the Sword Reverence Pagoda in Stalactite Mountain, Chan Ping'an stood up and planned to return to Stork Inn. After he stood up, however, he discovered a couple-like pair walking over from the distance. They were middle-aged and dressed in a simple but elegant manner, and they both had smiles on their ordinary-looking faces. They only took a quick glance at him before turning their attention to the Sword Reverence Pagoda behind him. Chan Ping'an looked down and retied the wine gourd to his waist. In fact, he hadn't taken another sip after sitting down. He was just about to leave. However, the woman smiled and asked in a gentle voice, This is our first time visiting the Sword Reverence Pagoda, and we've heard that the pagoda is very big inside. Is there anything we should keep in mind? Chan Ping'an stopped and pondered for a brief moment before nodding and replying, How about I show the 2 of you around? The man and woman exchanged a smile before nodding and saying, Sure thing. One from the poem On Double Ninth Day Thinking of My Brothers at Home. In reality, Chan Ping'an was slightly surprised by this situation. It was very rare for people to speak the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent in Stalactite Mountain. However, after traveling around the world for so long, Chan Ping'an also understood some basic etiquette. He knew that Buddhist monks didn't mention their names and Taoist priests didn't talk about their ages, so rashly asking others about their backgrounds also seemed to be quite inappropriate. Chan Ping'an led the couple into the Sword Reverence Pagoda, repeating to them what Jin Su had told him. Moreover, Chan Ping'an had always had a good memory, so when it came to the replica swords and picture scrolls of the sword immortals that he had gone to the effort to remember, he could immediately introduce their names as well as their basic history. While taking the couple around, Chan Ping'an also developed another thought. Since he had used a sword before, he might as well stay in Stalactite Mountain for a while longer. He could use this time to go around the Sword Reverence Pagoda and record information about the sword immortals and immortal swords that he felt a connection to. He would bring these back to the bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain, and he could go through them whenever he felt bored in the future. This would be similar to those small bamboo slips, on which he had engraved beautiful lines of poetry and profound teachings of wisdom. Qian Ping'an would sometimes place them under the sun, and even looking at them from a distance would make him feel especially warm and comfortable. It was as if the sun weren't shining on the small bamboo slips and the engraved characters, but shining on his heart instead. While recording the information, he could also use the opportunity to practice his handwriting. However, he was unsure of how much calligraphy brushes, ink, and paper cost in Stalactite Mountain. Would they be very expensive? The woman smiled and praised. Your memory is quite good. Qian Ping'an paused his thoughts and cracked a grin. This kind of ability was nothing in the mountains. Indeed, this woman was definitely being polite with him. In reality, Qian Ping'an was genuinely underestimating himself this time. This was because the couple had already confirmed that the young boy would be filled with confidence and certainty every time he set his eyes on a replica sword. This was a case of his heart arriving at the swords before his eyes arrived. This phenomenon related to a famous bottleneck for sword cultivators, and this bottleneck was something that would determine a sword cultivator's ultimate potential. Would they end up as a minor sword cultivator whose heart was restricted by their flying sword? Or would they become a great sword immortal who could command a myriad kinds of sword intent? After making their way through more than half of the display rooms, Qian Ping'an was still filled with patience and interest as he followed the couple around. The two were both looking at the displays very carefully. After roughly explaining the history of the Sword Reverence Pagoda to the couple, he intended to let them go by themselves and look at whichever sword immortal or immortal sword struck their fancy. However, the woman would still chat with Qian Ping'an from time to time, so the young boy decided to continue following them around. The man had barely spoken the entire time, but he suddenly said, I'll go ahead first and wait for you guys to catch up. The woman nodded and didn't think much about this, and she continued to chat with Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an had visited the Sword Reverence Pagoda only once, and he was actually quite unfamiliar with the history of the Sword Qi Great Wall apart from these renowned sword immortals honored in the display rooms. Surprisingly, it was this woman who was visiting for the first time who spoke eloquently and recounted the legends and achievements of many sword immortals. For example, she talked about the founding ancestor with the surname Dong. His sword was called Three Corpses. But this wasn't because he believed in Taoism. Instead, this was because he had once charged into the belly of the demonic world by himself, slaying 3 great demons at the upper 5 tiers along the way. The Dong clan had risen in status in the Sword Qi Great Wall because of this, and almost all of the subsequent clan leaders of the Dong clan had personally slain great demons at the unpolished Jade tier or even Immortal tier. Since they were talking about the Dong clan, the woman eagerly brought Qian Ping'an along as they looked for the replica sword, Bamboo Case. The owner of this sword was a clan rejuvenation ancestor of the Dong clan. Back then, the Dong clan had been facing a decreasing population and a lack of incense. The clan leader had also been severely wounded and killed by a great demon, and the Dong clan had been in a situation where the young couldn't replace the old. It was at that moment that a young golden core tier sword cultivator from the clan had resolutely stepped forward and taken the ancestral 3 meters tall with him as he retraced the demon-slaying path walked by their founding ancestor. Facing doubt from everyone, the sword cultivator had returned to the Sword Qi Great Wall with his sword after being away for more than 2 centuries. He had carried a bamboo case on his back, inside which rested the head of a 13th tier great demon. Before ascending the city wall, he had used 3 meters tall, which was already on the verge of shattering, to engrave the character Dong on the Sword Qi Great Wall. Afterward, this person had forged a new sword and named it Bamboo Case. From that time onward, the Dong clan became one of the most influential clans in the Sword Qi Great Wall. Through their conversation, the woman eventually learned that the young boy had the surname Qian. Upon learning this, she smiled and asked Qian Ping'an whether he had taken notice of the sword called Mountain Flying Over. A bashful smile appeared on Qian Ping'an's face, and he couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. This was because the owner of this strangely named sword was a sword immortal with the surname Qian. However, it was also because of this that Qian Ping'an had paid particular attention to this sword and remembered it very well. In fact, Qian Ping'an would very carefully remember the sword immortal, and their immortal sword as long as the sword immortal had the surname Qian. If it weren't for the fact that he hadn't learned how to paint, nor did he have painting masters like those on Osmanthus Island beside him to learn from, Qian Ping'an would have genuinely wanted to record the appearances of these sword immortals and bring them back to Downtrodden Mountain as well. Afterward, the woman smiled and picked a few sword immortals with the surname Qian to talk about, telling their soul-stirring stories to Qian Ping'an. When someone verbally told these stories, as opposed to reading a few concise and ice-cold words from a sign, the stories would often become far more spectacular and moving. They would become like monuments standing beside the long river of time. They would become like rows of willow trees under which future generations could stand under and enjoy shade. Amid this shade, one could witness the howling wind and destructive rain lashing the world beyond the protection of the trees. One could experience the turbulence and chaos ravaging those periods in history. Qian Ping'an, who had already decided not to drink again in the future, involuntarily started to drink again. Not being liked by the girl whom he liked was a very heartbreaking matter. However, the sky hadn't collapsed, so life would still go on as always. This was a realization that Qian Ping'an had suddenly come to after entering the Sword Reverence Pagoda again. However, after learning about the incredible feats of so many sword immortals, Qian Ping'an wouldn't turn around and dismiss his heartbreaking experience as a trivial and insignificant matter. To the young boy, this felt even more painful than those torturous training sessions in the bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain. The two types of pain were completely different. One was transient and it would disappear after he endured through it. However, one was entrancient, and it felt like something that might not be overcome in a day, a month, a year, 100 years, or even an entire lifetime. Strangest of all, Qian Ping'an felt even greater pain when he considered the possibility that one day in the future, he might like a different girl. The book said that using wine to drown one's sorrows would only lead to more sorrows. Thus, Qian Ping'an had been too afraid to drink wine just then. Before he knew it, it went from him taking the couple around to the woman describing the sword immortals and immortal swords to him in great detail. Everything flowed naturally, and neither of them felt was inappropriate. Qian Ping'an then saw the man standing at the doorway of the last display room, and smiling as he looked at the two of them. The man didn't like to speak, and he had only sized up Qian Ping'an a few times when walking with him just then. After entering the last display room, the woman exclaimed in astonishment when they walked over to Dogwood Cherry and Restful Bamboo Grove, two neighboring swords. Why is there no picture scroll for these two sword immortals? I heard that the owner of Dogwood Cherry was a very handsome man. Qian Ping'an could feel sweat forming on his forehead, and he carefully stole a glance at the middle-aged man standing beside him. He dearly hoped that the man wouldn't do anything stupid out of jealousy. Unexpectedly, however, the man immediately returned serve, saying, "The lady who owned Restful Bamboo Grove was also a stunning beauty, the kind rarely seen in the world." Qian Ping'an instantly wanted to defend the woman against this injustice. So what if she made a joke? As a man, he needed to be more magnanimous. How could he give tit for tat? The woman rolled her eyes at her husband. She then smiled at Qian Ping'an and said, "Thank you for showing us around the Sword Reverence Pagoda." Qian Ping'an shook his hands and said, "No problem, no problem. I also like wandering around in here. And I'll still be visiting over the next few days." The man narrowed his eyes and asked, "I heard that there was a little idiot in the Sword Reverence Pagoda who liked to wipe away the spittle on these two replica swords and sword stands. That little idiot wasn't you, was it?" Qian Ping'an wasn't willing to complicate matters, so he purposely put on a baffled expression as he vigorously shook his hands. "No, that definitely wasn't me. How could I possibly be so stupid?" The woman subtly stomped on the back of the man's foot. She then looked at Qian Ping'an and said, "We're about to leave. Do you want to leave with us? By the looks of it, you're also someone who likes to drink. Do you want to have a drink?" The man suddenly asked. "I know a good place that has cheap and good quality wine. Moreover, it only serves friends of the shop." Qian Ping'an shook his head in response. "You should accept the offer and have a drink if someone invites you," the man huffed. "You're still afraid of people with ulterior motives in Stalactite Mountain? In any case, do my wife and I look like bad people? Do we look like people who will covet your crappy sword and crappy sword nurturing gourd?" Qian Ping'an felt a little awkward. This man was far too frank and straightforward. His wife grumbled, "Humph, who told me they hated forced drinking the most?" The man didn't dare to argue with his wife, so he could only shoot a glare at Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an cracked a beaming smile at the woman. The man became increasingly ruffled, but he was already being dragged toward the entrance by his wife. The three of them exited the Sword Reverence Pagoda together and walked down the steps. After holding back for a long time, the man finally asked again, "You're truly not going to drink with us?" Stalactite Mountain's Forgetting Sorrow wine is something that all drunkards and wine immortals in Majestic World want to drink. According to legends, this wine is made using a unique method that the Confucian etiquette sage left behind back then. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so think about it carefully before giving me a response. Chen Ping'an glanced down at his sword-nurturing gourd. There was only a small bit of osmanthus wine remaining. The man clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "Young boy, with your fussy and hesitant personality, I say that even finding a wife for yourself will be difficult." This remark was like a dagger through Chen Ping'an's heart. I was truly too fussy and hesitant, and that's why I'm like a lonely ghost aimlessly wandering around Stalactite Mountain even though it's already midnight. Otherwise, I might be strolling around and enjoying the night scenery with Ning Yao. I'm not going to drink. So be it if I don't find a wife. Chen Ping'an humphed in reply. This was truly a rare display of anger from the young boy. Chen Ping'an's gaze shifted slightly, and his expression became much more amiable when he faced the woman. He cupped his fists and said, "Until we meet again, milady." The woman smiled faintly and persuaded, "You should really give Stalactite Mountain's Forgetting Sorrow wine a try. Even ordinary chi refiners at the unpolished jade tier find it extremely difficult to get a cup of this wine for themselves. We have some old relationship with the shopkeeper there, and it's thanks to this that we're able to enter the wine shop. If you genuinely like to drink, then you shouldn't let this opportunity slip by. Even if you don't like to drink, it's still best that you grab this opportunity with both hands." Chen Ping'an was slightly hesitant. The man started to drive home his point, saying, "See, just look at him. So hesitant and indecisive. Do you? In any case, I don't like it very much." Chen Ping'an's expression turned dark, and he thought to himself, "Why do I need you to like me?" Truthfully speaking, Chen Ping'an was a bit like an intoxicated drunkard tonight. His temper was truly bad. After all, even clay bodhisattvas had a temper. The woman ignored her petty husband, and she patted Chen Ping'an's shoulder as she said in amusement, "Let's go, let's have a drink together. I can tell that something's weighing on your mind, so don't pay any attention to his grumbling when we drink. Drink as much as you want. The heaven is vast and the earth is boundless, but your wine cup will be the largest of them all. The mountains are tall and the rivers stretch long, but the bottom of your cup will be so deep that even they can't fill it." Chen Ping'an scratched his head and walked forward with the woman. The man tagged along behind them, and he pursed his lips as he glanced back at the Sword Reverence Pagoda. A Taoist nun from Stalactite Mountain responsible for guarding the Sword Reverence Pagoda arrived at the plaza by the foot of Lone Peak after being thrown out of the Sword Reverence Pagoda by that person. She was on the verge of tears as she stood in front of the young Taoist priest, and she listed out that man's crimes to her master, who was flipping through a book. After absent-mindedly listening to the Taoist nun's angry complaints, the young Taoist priest asked, "You still don't know who he is?" The golden courtier Taoist nun dazedly shook her head. The young Taoist priest nodded and said, "Then this is a case of no knowledge, no fault. All right, you can leave now." The Taoist nun became increasingly confused. Behind them, the sword-hugging middle-aged man sitting on the hitching post took great pleasure in their misfortune. "To teach without strictness is a teacher's laziness, he remarked. "Utter nonsense," the young Taoist priest raged. "This is an argument from those bastard Confucian scholars, and my branch of Taoism has never promoted this thought before. When it comes to cultivating oneself and cultivating one's Tao, are these not matters in which one is solely responsible for themselves?" The Taoist nun trembled in fear. She stood still with her head lowered, and she didn't dare to move at all. The sword-hugging middle-aged man didn't stop there. Instead, he continued to fan the flames as he chuckled. "No wonder the picture of your Tao ancestor is hung so high up in the incense-offering tower. His picture is almost tens of thousands of kilometers away from that of your three branch masters, including your master." The young Taoist priest leaped up and exclaimed, "Are you looking for a beating?" The sword-hugging middle-aged man roared with laughter. "Thankfully, you didn't say that I'm seeking death. Otherwise, I would have needed to criticize you for spewing nonsense. I don't have any other strong points, and just like Aoyang said, my only strong point is my frankness. When it comes to sucking up to others or exposing others' shortcomings, even Aoyang said that I rank near the top in the Sword Qi Great Wall. The young Taoist priest gritted his teeth in anger, and he clasped his hands behind his back as he walked in circles around his large straw mat. Do you think that you're this place's Aoyang? You're a native refugee from that place, he muttered under his breath. If it weren't for my master warning me to get along peacefully with other people, I would have beaten you beyond recognition today. I couldn't care less whether you're being suppressed by the heaven and earth here and half a tier weaker than normal. So what if I achieve an unfair victory? I'll only feel satisfied after beating you to the point where you don't dare to meet others for an entire year. I'll beat you until you're like the senior brother who was staying on top of Lone Peak back then. You've pissed me off for many years already. The Taoist nun had initially hoped for her master to stand up for her, yet she felt nothing but regret at this moment as she looked at her master venting his anger in an extremely rare display. She shouldn't have come here to complain. This was especially the case after her master accidentally revealed some secrets. The Taoist nun felt like her life in Stalactite Mountain was about to become much more difficult. Perhaps the heavenly lord who guarded Lone Peak, the central region of Stalactite Mountain, couldn't be bothered dealing with her. However, his first disciple, the flood dragon true lord who held a fly whisk in his hands, was now the third in command in Stalactite Mountain. The flood dragon true lord was renowned for respecting his master, so he would definitely make things difficult for her until the end of time. Definitely. The Taoist nun truly wanted to cry. Why had fate given her a master who never protected his own disciples? Not long before, Chan Ping'an had mysteriously taken the husband and wife around the Sword Reverence Pagoda. And now, on the streets outside the Sword Reverence Pagoda, he was for some reason following them to some wine shop to drink some forgetting sorrow wine or whatnot. He would occasionally snap to his senses, and he would occasionally answer a question from the woman. After what felt like a long time, yet it also felt like a short 15 minutes, the three of them arrived at a wine shop that was yet to close for the night. However, business was slow, and there wasn't a single customer in the shop. There was only a young shop attendant snoozing on a table, and an old man playing with a caged oriole behind the bar counter. The old shopkeeper glanced at the couple and remarked, "Here come two rare and esteemed customers. I most certainly have to retrieve that wine now." He then glanced at the young boy with the sword case standing behind them, and he furrowed his brows before eventually heaving a sigh. He didn't say anything, and he seemingly decided to turn a blind eye to this because of their relationship. The old man turned to the lazy shop attendant and roared, "Su Jia, keep sleeping, why don't you? In fact, why don't you sleep to death? We have customers. Wake up and bring a jar of wine over." The young shop attendant called Su Jia immediately woke up with a start. He wiped away his drool and stood up in a listless manner, and his back was bent as he walked away to carry a jar of wine over. He placed the jar of wine on their table, yawning as he said, "Enjoy the wine, customers. Same rule as always, our wine shop doesn't provide any snacks." The woman nodded in acknowledgement and turned to Chan Ping'an, who was sitting opposite her. She smiled and said, "There was once a very impressive monk whose travels led him to this wine shop. After drinking some forgetting sorrow wine, he was full of praise and stated that only this wine could defeat the Buddha in his heart." The old shopkeeper smiled and concurred. Indeed, that old monk was truly powerful, and even Aoyang might not have been able to shatter that Baldy's small world with a few slashes. In the end, he was still trying to say that his wine was the most powerful in the world. However, Chan Ping'an was still very happy to hear someone else mention Aoyang in Stalactite Mountain. Thus he genuinely wanted to drink some wine now. Yet, the old shopkeeper immediately slammed his hand on the bar counter and fumed. "Fucking hell, just the mention of Aoyang makes my blood boil. He owes me money for more than 20 jars of wine. He's the only person in the world who owes me so much." There was Southern World Continent's Chan Chunan from back then, that martial goddess from not long ago, and also those old geezers from the 100 schools of thought from way back when. However, who dares to owe me wine money? Just think about that scholar from Middle-earth Divine Continent. When he was at his lowest moment, a time when he was yet to flourish, he was a measly C-observation tier chi refiner who could still write 100 poems after drinking 7 liters of wine. What wine did he drink? Wine from here, of course. However, after visiting 3 times, he only owed me money for 4 or 5 jars of wine in total. That Aoyang is committing grave sins. And I'm the one suffering grave consequences. The woman winked at Qian Ping'an, seemingly saying to him that the old shopkeeper was always. This was his temperament, so they should just let him be. There was no need to pay any heed to his antics. The young shop attendant was in low spirits as he grumbled. Old geezer, can you stop talking about Aoyang? Young mistress still hasn't returned to Stalactite Mountain because of him. I seriously miss young mistress to death. The old shopkeeper instantly became much quieter, mumbling. Heartless daughters like that should be left out of home to bring harm to other people instead. After opening the jar of wine, the man filled each of the 3 large white bowls on the table. Sure enough, he detested forced drinking the most, just as his wife had said. After pouring the 3 bowls of wine, he directly said, "Drink if you want to and suit yourself if you don't want to." Qian Ping'an carefully took a small sip of wine. There was no strong taste, and the wine was only slightly more potent than osmanthus wine. However, it couldn't be considered so potent that it burned one's throat and intestines. Qian Ping'an took 2 more sips, and his throat and stomach were still completely unaffected. He finally felt at ease. This forgetting sorrow wine was most likely special in some other mystical manner, not in its taste. After 2 large bowls each, the jar of wine quickly reached its bottom. The woman turned around with a smile and asked the old shopkeeper for another jar of wine. The old man sighed as he looked at the smiling woman, and he personally went to grab them another 2 jars of wine. After gently placing the jars on the table, he said, "These 3 jars of wine are on me. You don't need to pay for them." Qian Ping'an's face was flushed red because of the wine, but his head felt especially spacious and clear as if he weren't drunk at all. He didn't act drunk either. However, he could clearly feel that he was becoming a little tipsy. After drinking some wine, he wanted to say some things. Just like those wine burps, holding them in actually did no good at all. It was ultimately better to let them out. In the beginning, the man lowered his head and focused on drinking. From time to time, he would look up with an adrift expression and gaze outside the wine shop. Meanwhile, the woman seemingly enjoyed chatting with Qian Ping'an. They chatted about the young boy's hometown, and they chatted about his 2 distant journeys. Since Qian Ping'an wasn't drunk, he consciously picked the people and matters that he could talk about. After a while, they somehow started to talk about that young girl. Qian Ping'an, who decided he would stop drinking after 4 large bowls, quietly poured himself another bowl of wine. However, he still didn't talk about his sword delivery to Stalactite Mountain. He simply said that he needed to deal with some matters, so he had left home to come to Stalactite Mountain. There was coincidentally a young girl whom he was acquainted with living in the Sword Chi Great Wall, so the 2 of them had eventually come across each other in Stalactite Mountain. Their encounter was as simple as this. The woman smiled faintly and asked, "Then you walked a long way to get here?" Qian Ping'an raised his bowl and pondered for a moment. He then shook his head and replied, "No, it wasn't far at all. I thought to myself that each step would lead me closer. So this distance didn't feel far anymore." The man smiled coldly and questioned, "How long have you known that young girl for? How long have you spent with her? Yet you keep saying that you like her already? Isn't this behavior a little too frivolous?" Qian Ping'an didn't know how to respond, so he could only reply with a glum expression, "I can't control who I like. If you feel like I'm frivolous, then you're free to think what you want. I won't try to convince you otherwise." The man humphed coldly, most likely hurt by Qian Ping'an's words as well. Most importantly, the young boy had spoken in a very sincere manner. Who knew, maybe the rumors in the mountains were true. When drinking the forgetting sorrow wine, one becomes their truthful self. And then you were rejected by the young girl? Don't be discouraged. Have you heard that a chance encounter between some people is destined to be positive, while a reunion between them will be even better? The woman consoled. Qian Ping'an drank a large mouthful of wine. He felt slightly drunk and hazy, but his eyes were still especially bright and limpid, just like water flowing down a serene spring, carrying with it happiness, sadness, disappointment, and affection. Moreover, these were all pure and unsullied emotions. The young boy shook his head and replied, "If I like someone, then I have to make her happy. If I'm adamant that someone has to be with me if I like them, then can this still be considered liking them? Tears streamed down the young boy's face after he said this, and he continued, however, even though I say this, I'm still incredibly sad right now. In fact, I want the entire stalactite mountain and the entire majestic world to know that I like that girl. And I hope that that one girl, will also like me. In the end, Qian Ping'an genuinely became drunk, so much so that he forgot how many large bowls of wine he had drunk. He rested his head on the table and continued to murmur. In fact, he even forgot how he had argued and even fought with that man. This was like a dream, yet he was seemingly aware of everything. This was like sleep, yet he was seemingly awake and conscious. In a fit of rage, he had seemingly shot from the 4th tier of martial arts to the 7th tier of martial arts as well, forever losing the fated opportunity to become the most powerful 4th tier martial artist. The woman seemingly asked him, is it worth it to abandon your martial arts potential for the sake of fighting for the justice of a girl's parents? How will you become the most powerful sword immortal, great sword immortal, in the future? At the time, Qian Ping'an's reply was, liking a girl doesn't stop with simply saying so. If I don't do this today, and let's pretend that the two of you are Ningyao's parents, do you feel like Qian Ping'an, will sacrifice important things for your daughter when I become a rich and high-tier great sword immortal in the future? No. That kind of affection can't be considered deep affection. It's definitely a lie from the very beginning. Qian Ping'an couldn't remember any of this. The old shopkeeper was calm and unfazed. Through tens of thousands of years, he was already accustomed to seeing all kinds of people and human emotions. By contrast, the young shop attendant sat nearby and listened with relish. In the end, Qian Ping'an eventually fell asleep in a drunken state. The man glanced at the young boy and took a sip of wine. I still don't, young boy, blockhead, idiotic, dull, not dashing enough, not courageous enough, only mediocre talent, a so-so disposition, and a very stubborn temper. If he gets into an argument with our daughter in the future, and if both of them are unwilling to take a step back, what will happen then? With our daughter's personality, will she possibly yield and apologize? The woman smiled in amusement and replied, apologize? So you're aware that our daughter will most likely be the one in the wrong? You're aware that the young boy will always try to satisfy her needs. The man felt slightly guilty, so he huffed and didn't say anything else. The woman suddenly smiled and added, oh, I recall you also said that he isn't dashing enough. Dashing in the sense of scholars and literati, or dashing in the sense of attracting other women. There was concealed killing intent. A brilliant thought suddenly occurred to the man, and even he felt impressed by his own quick thinking. He raised his wine bowl and said in a proud manner, dashing in the sense of carving characters onto the sword chi great wall. The woman smiled in reply. The man chuckled dryly, and he found a path on which to retreat. In fact, that silly boy is quite a good person. Our daughter genuinely needs to find someone like him. There was a warm smile on the woman's face as she gazed outside the wine shop. Sorry, she suddenly murmured. The man beside her, their daughter Ningyao, the sword chi great wall and majestic world. She was sorry to all of them. The husband and wife both used some illusion technique, disappearing from view after Qian Ping'an became drunk and unconscious. The girl that Qian Ping'an liked looked a bit like him and also a bit like her. The man gently grabbed his wife's hand and said, we're only sorry to our daughter. We don't need to apologize to anyone else. A dazzling smile suddenly appeared on his face as he looked at Qian Ping'an, and he remarked, our daughter's judgment is truly very impressive. Just like mine. The woman nodded and said with a smile. The man suddenly felt a little exasperated and he complained, is it really that difficult for our silly daughter to say those words? Of course it's very difficult, the woman replied with a nod. If a girl likes a boy, will she want the boy to like someone who will eventually die on the battlefield? The man slapped his forehead and exclaimed, good heavens! How bloody complicated! In the sword chi great wall, on a stone cliff that was actually a dragon-slaying platform, a young girl lay there and silently murmured, listen to me, Qian Ping'an, I don't dislike you. The warm rays of the morning sun shone into the wine shop. The old shopkeeper was whistling and teasing the caged oriole, yet the oriole sparrow was as cold and aloof as a celestial maiden from the mountains. However, this raised the old shopkeeper's fighting spirit, and the old man eagerly showed off his skills as he skillfully whistled. Elsewhere, the young shop attendant was diligently cleaning the wine shop. The tables and chairs were already spotless to begin with, Yet they became even more sparkling clean after he attended to them. He would occasionally breathe onto the furniture before using his sleeves to carefully wipe them clean. He was radiating with a feeling of satisfaction. To this young shop attendant in the wine shop in Stalactite Mountain, it seemed as if cleaning up the shop was the most satisfying and happy thing in the world. Qian Ping'an, whose arms and head were resting on the table, slowly woke from his drunken slumber. He didn't have a splitting headache from being hung over, and simply felt a little dazed and adrift. He was at a slight loss as he sat there, and he racked his brain as hard as he could to recall what happened last night. However, he surprisingly couldn't recall anything at all. He only remembered accepting the couple's offer to come here and drink Forgetting Sorrow wine, a type of wine that even unpolished jade-tier cultivators had a difficult time getting their hands on. What was the true identity of that couple? What had he discussed with them? And when had they left? He couldn't remember any of this. That wine was clearly called Forgetting Sorrow wine, but what had he actually forgotten? Rather than forgetting his sorrows, Qian Ping'an felt even more troubled and sorrowful now. He felt like there was a hint of sadness lingering in his heart, unable to be dispersed. This was like an oriole stopping on his earthen windowsill in Clay-Vase Alley early one morning. It might chirp and disturb his sweet dreams, but he would still feel reluctant to shoo it away. Qian Ping'an looked around, and he saw the diligently working young attendant as well as the carefree old shopkeeper. "I'll grab the bill now," the young boy asked tentatively. The young shop attendant wiping a table leg grinned and didn't say anything. The old shopkeeper smiled and replied, "The three of you drank 4 jars of wine in total, and 3 of them were on me. So, young boy, you actually do need to foot the bill for the last one. How much is it?" Qian Ping'an asked. The old shopkeeper chortled with laughter. "How much? If you want to use money to purchase a jar of golden millet wine, then that will really set you back quite a bit." The young shop attendant, whom the old shopkeeper had referred to as Su Jia, chuckled and said, "Last night, a wealthy young master from pure white continent visited our wine shop because of its good reputation. He wanted to buy a jar of Forgetting Sorrow wine to bring home. However, our shopkeeper was unwilling to sell him anything, saying that this wasn't a matter of money. The young master kept pestering us, and he insisted on getting a price for the wine. However, he was stupefied when he eventually learned of the number. Would you look, he's been sitting on the steps outside the shop in a daze for the entire night. I say that he still hasn't given up yet." "Lu Yuzhou?" Qian Ping'an asked. The old shopkeeper nodded and replied, "That's him, the future clan leader of Pure White Continent's Lu clan. He's known as the Treasure Child, and his container treasure is filled with all kinds of immortal treasures. Because of the Ape Havoc estate, everyone in Stalactite Mountain has heard of this wealthy young master's title. One time he formed a group of 8 people to adventure and train in Middle-earth Divine Continent. Yet they came across some powerful enemies during their journey. Lu Yuzhou retrieved 7 high-grade immortal treasures at once, all of them powerful offensive treasures. He then retrieved defensive immortal treasures to surround the group until they were like a turtle. To say nothing of sage-named talismans, he was able to summon 2 suits of divine dew-bearing armor. Meanwhile, the 7 other people in the group relied on the offensive immortal treasures to forcefully kill an earth immortal entity that was 2 entire tiers above them. It was evident that the old shopkeeper felt young boy was worth saying a few words about. He chuckled and continued, "Such an interesting young boy. Even I almost couldn't help but give him a bowl of golden millet wine for free." Qian Ping'an felt slightly ashamed on behalf of his acquaintance. Just how scared of death was Lu Yuzhou? There was slight unease in Qian Ping'an's voice as he asked, "Old mister, how should I pay?" The old shopkeeper pondered for a moment before replying, "I haven't come up with a payment option yet, so I'll look for you in the future when I come up with something." Qian Ping'an felt both relieved and anxious upon hearing this. The old shopkeeper smiled and added, "It's also possible that I won't recall this before you pass from this world, so don't feel afraid." Qian Ping'an breathed a soft sigh of relief. He stood up and was just about to leave, yet the old shopkeeper asked, "Young boy, there's still almost half a jar of golden millet wine remaining. You're not going to drink it first before leaving?" Qian Ping'an reached over and swirled the jar of wine. Sure enough, there was still almost half a jar remaining. "I can't take it with me?" he asked in puzzlement. The old shopkeeper shook his head and replied, If you take it away, then you won't be able to forget your sorrows anymore. It will become even inferior to ordinary wine. That's a reckless waste of this valuable wine, so I encourage you not to do something so stupid. There's something unique about this wine, and that couple inviting you to drink it now is already a humongous waste. The later in life you drink it, the better. However, it's very difficult to pursue the notion of better all the time, and sometimes you just need to go with the flow and take things as they come. You should be satisfied as long as the outcome is good. Chen Ping'an sat back down and asked in curiosity, "Isn't it called forgetting sorrow wine? Mr. Shopkeeper, why do you keep calling it golden millet wine?" Su Jia, the young shop attendant, widened his eyes in shock. It was as if he had seen a ghost in the morning, and he exclaimed, "You don't know where this place is?" Chen Ping'an felt increasingly puzzled, and he replied, "Isn't this Stalactite Mountain?" Su Jia grinned and asked, "Then you should know about the golden millet blessed land, right?" Chen Ping'an shook his head in response. The old shopkeeper came to Chen Ping'an's rescue, saying, "It's understandable that you're not aware of this place. This blessed land is in the same state as your hometown Jewel Small World. It's already been destroyed." Su Jia hurriedly threw his towel away and said with urgency, Shopkeeper, let me explain the rest. Young mistress said that I look extremely handsome when I tell this story." The old shopkeeper chuckled and said, "Either my daughter is blind, or she was speaking nonsense after having too much to drink. Tell me, which one is more likely?" "Young mistress is healthy and well." Su Jia coughed and cleared his throat before putting on a serious expression and beginning, "Right now, only some ruins remain of the golden millet blessed land. Back in its glory days, those in the world who felt sorrow all yearned to travel to the golden millet blessed land, making it a bustling world filled with beautiful people and beautiful scenes, beautiful wine and beautiful dreams. This blessed land had everything. Moreover, it was guaranteed that the things in this blessed land would align with one's wishes. This was the rarest quality of the blessed land. Not only that, but the blessed land could also reflect one's Tao heart. There are many unpolished jade tier cultivators who barely manage to advance to the upper 5 tiers. Earlier in their cultivation journey, these cultivators relied on fortune, as well as many secret techniques and heretical methods from all kinds of different teachings to advance their cultivation base. Thus, these cultivators will especially travel to this wine shop in Stalactite Mountain. They'll strip back their layers of souls while remaining conscious, and they'll drink a jar of forgetting sorrow wine after that to discover their true heart. Seizing this opportunity, they'll gain an uninhibited view of their heart. At that time, they can either analyze the finest details of their heart layer by layer, or they can determine what areas need strengthening. Su Jia was filled with spirit as he spoke, yet the old shopkeeper impatiently cut him off, saying, "Hold it right there. You keep repeating this ancient history over and over again, so are you not afraid of it getting rotten and boring? To put things simply, this small wine shop is the last remaining land of the golden millet blessed land." Chen Ping'an poured himself a bowl of wine and looked around. He was truly unable to view this shop as a blessed land. In reality, there was also a blessed land in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, the Limpid Pond Blessed Land. This blessed land was controlled by Divine Edict sect. According to rumors, Parasol Leaf Continent's Jade Tablet sect also controlled a blessed land, Cloud Cave Blessed Land. Chen Ping'an drank some wine and asked, "Old mister, I didn't do anything stupid last night, did I? Also, where did that couple go?" "You don't remember?" the old shopkeeper asked. Chen Ping'an shook his head. "Even you don't remember, so why do I, an outsider, have to remember?" the old shopkeeper replied with a chuckle. Chen Ping'an was unable to counter this, so he could only drink wine in silence. He still couldn't determine whether this wine was good or bad. However, he felt like it went down very smoothly. The old shopkeeper suddenly remembered something, and he pointed at a wall and said to Chen Ping'an, "Do you see that wall over there? Those who have enjoyed wine here can all go over to write a poem or a few words on that wall." Su Jia put on a mature tone and said, "After drinking this wine, there can be 2 potential outcomes. One type is becoming drunk and pissing off, after which one will waste away the rest of their life in jars of wine. Even until death, they'll never regain sobriety. The other type is comprehensively waking up and seeing through the meaning of life. These people have yet to experience an entire lifetime, yet it's as if they've already experienced the ups and downs of several lifetimes. I feel like the poems and thoughts written by these two types of people are particularly interesting. Customer, do you want to give it a go? The old shopkeeper chuckled in anger and said, Piss right off, why don't you? My teeth are almost about to rot away from the cringe. You're just a kid. Yet you're always trying to emulate Aoyang. Don't you find it embarrassing? Young mistress likes Aoyang very much, so if I don't emulate him, who else should I emulate? Su Jia replied in a righteous voice. Those who learn from me live, those who emulate me die too, the old shopkeeper said with emotion. You've seen so many drunkards and heard so many drunken remarks, so how do you still not understand this? I'm learning from Aoyang, not learning from you, Su Jia replied with a chuckle. The old shopkeeper threw a wine cup at the young shop attendant and scolded. All you do is talk like a smartarse. Su Jia gently caught the wine cup and tossed it high up back to the old shopkeeper. He then quickly jogged over to Chen Ping'an and gave the young boy a calligraphy brush. Here, leave your thoughts on the wall. Chen Ping'an put his wine bowl down and said in reluctance, My handwriting is very bad. Su Jia rolled his eyes and replied, Can it be any worse than Aoyang's worm-like characters? In any case, even the characters of those well-renowned calligraphy masters are belittled as squashed toads, dead snakes, or a crude soldier's embroidery by their peers. The young shop attendant lowered his voice and continued, I'll be honest with you. No matter how bad someone's handwriting, their characters will definitely look as beautiful as celestial immortals compared to Aoyang's characters. If you don't believe me, then head over and have a look for yourself. Chen Ping'an still didn't accept the calligraphy brush. However, he stood up and walked toward that wall. From a distance, the wall looked blank and without any trace of ink. After walking close to it, however, one would discover that the wall was filled with lines of poetry, essays, and warnings. There was a spectacular mixture of writing styles and works. Someone's writing clearly stood out from the others. This was a poem written in cursive script and taking up a very large space on the wall. The different works on the wall were like a bouquet of flowers, with each flower fighting to display its flourishing beauty. Among them, it was as if one flower dazzled more than all others, capturing everyone's gaze. There were also works that appeared out of place and inharmonious, with the most jarring one being a line of large characters that were crooked and messy. Even Chen Ping'an felt like it was unsightly. Not only that, but its contents also rendered people speechless. Whenever I think of all the girls who are waiting for me with impassioned love, my heart can't help but ache. Most importantly, there was also a smiley face and a thumbs up drawn at the end of the characters. There was no doubt that these characters had been personally written by Aoyang. After all, ordinary people wouldn't be shameless enough to write something. Chen Ping'an suppressed a smile as he turned around and asked, Old mister, you're going to keep this on the wall? The young shop attendant who was holding the calligraphy brush for Chen Ping'an appeared listless and sickly as he replied. Firstly, Aoyang is extremely shameless. He said that each character we wipe off will be equivalent to him returning money for 1 jar of wine. Secondly, young mistress is extremely fond of this line, and she thinks that Aoyang is praising her. Young mistress even used a jar of golden millet wine to purchase a romantic novel from a fictionist master. The novel was about her and Aoyang. Shopkeeper, what was the novel called again? Lingering Sadness, the old shopkeeper replied with a cold chuckle. Su Jia nodded and continued. That's right. In reality, young mistress hinted to the fictionist that he should write the romance as blatantly as possible. However, the fictionist master most likely found it too shameless to write in such a blatant manner, so he kept the romance more reserved and subtle. Young mistress was very displeased, so she said that she was going to elope when running away from home this time. However, one of her objectives is also to find this fictionist and give him trouble. His novel was far too crappy, and young mistress claimed that he was nothing more than a scammer fishing for fame. She's determined to find him and spit on his face. Chen Ping'an's gaze traveled across the wall, and he eventually lowered his head and found a line of small characters in the corner. This line was also written by Aoyang, but it didn't seem jarring at all. Little, there's nothing good about the cultivation world. Only the wine is somewhat decent. After writing this, Aoyang had drawn a blob of ink over the character after little. I can write anything I want? Chen Ping'an asked. Su Jia handed him the calligraphy brush and replied with a nod. Yes, anything you want. As long as you write in a blank area. You can write whatever tickles your fancy. After saying this, the young shop attendant didn't forget to add, "Customer, please don't write blah 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 was here. That's far too tacky and basic. In fact, even Aoyang's shameless words are better than that." Chen Ping'an accepted the calligraphy brush before suddenly running to his table. He drank a large mouthful of wine, and only then did he return to the wall. He half-squatted and wrote a small chi behind the character little, and above the blob of ink. "Little chi, there's nothing good about the cultivation world. Only the wine is somewhat decent. The character doesn't have much spirit, and it's simply written in a proper manner. However, it appears much better when placed next to Aoyang's characters. This is called cheating." "No, you need to write a line somewhere else," the old shopkeeper said in amusement. Chen Ping'an nodded and started to look for a blank space on the wall. However, the central region of the wall was already tightly packed with characters. It was indeed possible to thread the needle and write something small there, but Chen Ping'an felt like that would be disrespectful toward his predecessors. Moreover, most of the people who dared to write in the central region of the wall all had very impressive handwriting. Thus, Chen Ping'an truly didn't dare to write there. Because of this, he tried his best to look for empty space in one of the four corners of the wall. Su Jia suggested two locations with quite a bit of empty space. One location was in the top right and one location was in the bottom left. Chen Ping'an shuffled over and squatted down near the bottom left corner of the wall. He took a deep breath and wrote 3 characters. Before writing these characters, he recalled the many sword immortals and immortal swords in the Sword Reverence Pagoda. Thus, his 3 characters were Lasting Sword Chi. Su Jia looked at the 3 characters which were written in a straight and proper manner. They were truly uninteresting, so he shook his head and didn't think much about them. At the same time, he couldn't help but mumble, "It's clear that he hasn't read much." The old shopkeeper echoed the young shop attendant's sentiment in a rare display, nodding and saying with a smile, "He also hasn't drunk enough wine yet. Hey, young boy with the surname Chan from the Great Li Empire, there's no need to be in such a hurry. Drink a bowl of wine first, and after you feel satisfied, write something from your heart. It's not as difficult as you think. I treated you to 3 jars of wine, so I'll also let you write 3 lines of characters. You still have 1 chance left." However, Chen Ping'an had already returned the calligraphy brush to Su Jia. He smiled at the old shopkeeper and said, "There's no need." The old shopkeeper didn't mind this. Immortals creating valuable works of ink in a drunken state was a minor matter to bring good omen. It was simply an added bonus. Since the young boy didn't have impressive handwriting, nor was he a sword immortal, the old shopkeeper naturally wouldn't force him to write another line. Chen Ping'an hesitated for a moment before asking, "Old mister, can I save this half jar of wine for later? I want to go to the Sword Chi Great Wall first and drink it after I return. Is that okay?" Su Jia vigorously shook his head, saying, "There's no such service in our wine shop. Once the clay seal of the jar is broken, you have to drink the golden millet wine in one sitting. There's no service that allows you to leave and come back later to finish your wine." The old shopkeeper thought about this for a brief moment before nodding and replying, "I'll allow it this one time." "How come?" Su Jia exclaimed in panic. The old shopkeeper placed the birdcage beside his hand. He then leaned on the bar counter and replied with a faint smile, "I like the notion of saving. This is very auspicious and joyful." When Chen Ping'an stepped out of the wine shop, he surprisingly tripped and stumbled. When he stabilized himself and looked back, he found that there was no wine shop at all. There was only empty space. Inside the wine shop that had vanished without a trace, the old shopkeeper opened the birdcage and let out the golden-beaked oriole. However, before it could approach the wall of characters to adeptly examine a certain person's martial fortune, it hurriedly turned around and flew back to its cage in a flash. Su Jia was dumbfounded when he saw this. The old shopkeeper pondered for a moment before sighing, "So be it. He's only a young boy from a small continent, so what does it matter if he possesses this sapling of marriage affinity? It will only be a measly 100 years. Whether we examine his fortune or not won't make a difference." Su Jia angrily glared at a line of characters at the very top of the wall. Almost everyone wrote from top to bottom in a straight line, and only a single person apart from Aoyang had done otherwise in the past 100 years. This was a female customer who had visited not long ago. and she was the only person after Aoyang who had written her characters horizontally. Moreover, her characters had terrified the small oriole and caused it to wildly flutter around. It had taken more than half a day for the oriole to recover, and it was as if it had suffered a long bout of sickness. The young shop attendant couldn't help but grumble. It's all the fault of that martial goddess supreme martial fortune. Its aura is far too terrifying. There was adoration and kindliness in the old shopkeeper's eyes as he looked at the pitiful little oriole. "I've made you suffer," he murmured. There was a pair of unique orioles in the world, able to peck scholarly fortune and carry martial fortune. According to rumors, the male oriole had been captured by Taoist branchmaster Lu Chan, while the female oriole was being raised by the founder of syncretism. Chen Ping'an walked along a secluded alleyway. Even though he experienced a confusing night of drinking, he suddenly came to a realization after walking out of the wine shop. Chen Ping'an grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and started to drink the remaining osmanthus wine. There wasn't much left, and he continued to mumble as he drank. "Ning Yao most likely doesn't like you. Otherwise, how could she forget her promise? Back in Jewel's small world, she said that she would give a sword scabbard to you. Chen Ping'an, you're truly an unlucky bastard. This isn't a matter of whether Ning Yao likes you or not. Instead, this is a matter of whether Ning Yao detests you or not." With this in mind, the young boy felt a little content as he sought joy amid pain. At the very least, he hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. He had gained a lot of experience. However, he decided that he would still go to the Sword Chi Great Wall. He continually told himself that he would only go there for a quick look. He wanted to look at those large characters engraved on the Sword Chi Great Wall. At most, he would coincidentally come across that young girl at some place at some time. He would confidently smile and greet her. However, Chen Ping'an was still unsure about how he would greet her. Should he say, "What a coincidence," or should he say, "Oh, you're also here"? He didn't know which one was more suitable. Chen Ping'an was completely focused on solving this problem. So much so that he didn't notice the person walking behind him, a young girl who was almost angered to death. She was dressed in a dark green robe. Just as she couldn't hold back any longer and was about to kick Chen Ping'an suddenly vanished from the alleyway. It was as if someone had grabbed him and dragged him into another world. The young girl suddenly felt very empty. The space in front of her was empty, and her heart was also empty. She started to seethe with anger. She was just about to draw her sword and follow those traces to tear open the fissure among heaven and earth. However, it was also at this instant that her cheeks suddenly flushed a slight shade of red. She seemingly heard something, and she replied with a quick, "Oh." She then humped coldly at the location where Chen Ping'an had vanished. After doing this, she flew toward the plaza at the foot of Lone Peak. After seeing this young girl who completely ignored the rules again, the young Taoist priest was so enraged that he was about to explode. He angrily threw his book to the floor and jumped up from his straw mat, scolding in fury, "Little girl, do you really think Stalactite Mountain is your bloody backyard? You come as you please and you leave as you please. This is already the third time. The third time. Even the sword immortals from the Sword Chi Great Wall might not break this rule a single time in their lives. Yet what about you? You've broken it 2 times in a single day." The sword-hugging middle-aged man yawned and said, "You can hit her if you're so capable. Do you truly think I don't dare to?" The young Taoist priest fumed. "If I weren't taking pity on her because of her misfortunes, I would have thrown a single punch and—" The gallant-looking young girl was expressionless as she walked through the mirror-like gate. She leaned back slightly to face the young Taoist priest and she said, "Why are you taking pity on me? It's not like we're very familiar with each other." The young Taoist priest felt like the young girl's words were very unreasonable. At the same time, however, they also seemed slightly reasonable. Sitting on the hitching post, the sword-hugging middle-aged man held his belly and roared with laughter. They had both walked out from that wine shop in Stalactite Mountain. When Chen Ping'an walked out, he arrived in a secluded alleyway. When Lu Yuzhou walked out, however, he arrived under an ancient locust tree outside the tall walls of a courtyard. He squatted down in boredom and started to count the ants crawling along the ground. The old woman, an earth immortal, silently stood beside her young master and didn't disturb his daydreaming. The sun slowly peeked over the horizon and illuminated the sky. Lu Yuzhou stood up with a bright glimmer in his eyes, and he turned around as if he were asking the old woman for praise. I finally understand now. Ants that have grown up in Stalactite Mountain are no different from ants that have grown up in ordinary cities and towns. The old woman was already accustomed to the young boy's wild imagination, so she simply nodded with a faint smile. Lu Yuzhou glanced at the old locust tree and said in low spirits, "I'm not going to buy it, it's far too expensive. I can't bear to give away my hard-earned New Year's money just like that. I've already saved up for so many years." The old woman breathed a sigh of relief. She was genuinely afraid that her young master would impulsively throw away all of his money to buy a jar of forgetting sorrow wine. In any case, this golden millet wine had little benefit to qi refiners at the middle 5 tiers. Regardless of how wealthy pure white continent's Lu clan was, the young master still shouldn't spend money in a profligate manner. If he did, he naturally wouldn't receive punishment. In fact, the clan leader and elders might even have to smile through gritted teeth and praise him for being a good descendant of the Lu clan. They would have to praise him as confident and generous. After all, would someone hesitant to spend money be worthy of becoming the Lu clan's future clan leader? However, she would definitely be reprimanded. The old woman wasn't complaining about Lu Yuzhou because of this. Instead, she only wanted the best for him. With so much New Year's money, wouldn't it be quite good to buy a pseudo-celestial tool? Why be stubbornly focused on a jar of wine? Lu Yuzhou turned around and started to return home. While walking, he suddenly asked, "Grandma Lu, do you think Aunt Lu has returned from the ice fields in the north yet?" When Lu Yuzhou mentioned Aunt Lu, a beaming expression of pride immediately appeared on the old woman's face filled with wrinkles and marks of vicissitudes. "She's most likely returned. If that damned girl is lucky, then perhaps she's already advanced to the 9th tier of martial arts as well. Young master, according to the agreement, you can ask her to bring you to the ice fields in the north at that time. You can go there to slay great demons." Lu Yuzhou was still a young child after all, so his reply was also slightly childish. "Why has she advanced to the 9th tier so quickly? My father said that it was extremely significant for Aunt Lu to become the strongest 8th tier martial artist. It's far better than being a weak N-tier grandmaster." When they were speaking in person, my father persuaded Aunt Lu not to carelessly advance her cultivation base unless she had no other option. The old woman chuckled softly and explained, "The clan leader was naturally speaking with good intentions. However, we should never take things to extremes. If a pure martial artist can smoothly advance to the next tier, then they shouldn't forcefully suppress their cultivation base and hold back. Otherwise, that will lead to imperfections. In fact, they might lose all hope of advancing beyond the 10th tier. Of course, this is irrelevant for ordinary prodigies. Being able to advance to the 10th tier with much difficulty is already a wild dream for them. However, your Aunt Lu is different." Lu Yuzhou had never been overly interested in these matters pertaining to the foundation of the Great Tao. Instead, he mulled over the most unimportant matters as he sighed. "That Aunt Lu, seriously. She always complains and loudly asks about where all of the good men in the world have pissed off to. She also likes to ask me if I've come across any good men. As a proud man myself, how am I supposed to answer her? Moreover, my father introduced so many young prodigies from pure white continent to Aunt Lu, yet she didn't seem to be interested in any of them. What a massive headache." Lu Yuzhou's train of thought was truly very unique. He continued with another question that the old woman found funny, saying, "If the demonic army drowns the Sword Qi Great Wall one day, what will happen to Stalactite Mountain? That nest of ants under the locust tree crawls so slowly, so will they be able to move nests in time?" There was a kindly expression on the old woman's face as she replied in a gentle voice, "Young master, just how many years has the Sword Qi Great Wall stood strong for? In the world next to us, the demon tribe launches a powerful assault every 100 years or so. After all these years, how many corpses have those bloodthirsty beasts left at the foot of the Sword Qi Great Wall? Yet, when have they ever succeeded? There are indeed some astonishingly powerful great demons, but they can only stay on the city wall for a short while before being pushed off by some old sword immortals." Lu Yuzhou nodded in understanding. However, he quickly reverted to his own train of thought, and he was unable to extract himself from this as he said in anxiousness, "Our clan's ape havoc estate is actually inferior to that nest of ants. It can't be lifted up and moved. Fortunately, Pure White Continent is far away from Stalactite Mountain. Southern World Continent is quite pitiful. It will definitely be filled with tens of thousands of kilometers of smoke and ashes at that time. I wonder if pure Confucian Chang clan's old ancestor, that old man with the sun and moon on his shoulders, can unleash his formidable power and keep the sea of demons off the land? The old woman was amused by her young master's groundless worries, and she couldn't help but smile and reply, "That's right, our Pure White Continent is very far away from this stalactite mountain. Not only does the Southern World Continent lay between us, but there's even Middle Earth Divine Continent that's larger than the 8 other continents combined." "Young master, what is there to worry about?" "I'm not worried about Pure White Continent's safety," Lu Yuzhou murmured. "I simply feel uncomfortable when I think about the fact that many people will end up dying in such a war. Southern World Continent at least has the most powerful disciple of the second sage. However, what about Parasol Leaf Continent in the southeast that we traveled to before? And what about Circling Ascension Continent that we're about to travel to? I don't think these continents have any cultivators powerful enough to protect them." The old woman chuckled and replied, "Young master, you shouldn't compare everyone to your father. Is a chi refiner not impressive simply because they're weaker than our clan leader? There's no such thing. The wealthiest individual in Pure White Continent and the most powerful chi refiner in Pure White Continent were the same person. Lu Yozhou's father. This man had a higher cultivation base than any old ancestor in the history of the Lu clan, as well as superior combat power. Pure White Continent was a place where people were tough and immortals liked to fight. Thus, it was terrifying to know that no one had ever managed to successfully gauge this man's complete power. This man had also spoken a sentence that was extremely popular in the mountains: "If we can solve a problem using celestial tools or pseudo-celestial tools, then we shouldn't use our fists and legs, right?" Lu Yuzhou seemingly had many gripes with his father, and he grumbled, "And he has a large group of wives and mistresses as well. What's so good about that?" Regardless of what happened, the old woman didn't dare to comment on whether the clan leader was good or bad. The clan leader having a good temper was one matter, and subordinates and servants not abiding by rules and etiquette was another matter altogether. The Lu clan had an iron grip on the mountain range where jade was mined to mint snowflake coins. However, tall trees caught more wind, so many people died each year because they couldn't keep their mouths shut. Among the deceased, there would always be quite a number of descendants from the various branches of the Lu clan. Right now, Lu Yuzhou was still wearing the bright yellow bamboo robe named Refreshing. This robe was once the treasured possession of an emperor from a large empire in Middle Earth Divine Continent, and the robe was also praised as a small grotto heaven by many people. Pure White Continent's Lu clan also owned another bamboo robe named Escaping Summer Heat. This bamboo robe formed a pair with Refreshing, and many people praised this robe as a small blessed land. Lu Yuzhou liked to switch between the 2 bamboo robes. These robes were comfortable, and they weren't too flashy either. Otherwise, it would be far too eye-catching if he wore those Taoist talisman robes or the divine dew-bearing armor. If he wore those, wouldn't he be announcing to the entire world that he was very wealthy? I am indeed wealthy, but I don't like to say this to others. In any case, I can't be considered a genuinely wealthy person. After all, I couldn't even bring myself to purchase a jar of Forgetting Sorrow wine last night, right? Lu Yuzhou sighed and asked, "Grandma Lu, am I really not allowed to go to the Sword Chi Great Wall? The clan leader has given me instructions about this. You're definitely not allowed to go," the old woman replied in a firm voice. Lu Yuzhou asked a question that cut straight to the core of the issue. At the end of the day, the Sword Chi Great Wall is still populated by convicts and refugees from Majestic World. In other words, their relationship with this side of the gate is not as amiable as we think. To add to that, there are also many dirty things going on in Stalactite Mountain. After sacrificing so much and having so many members killed by the demon tribe, has no one ever betrayed the Sword Chi Great Wall and defected to the demon tribe in anger? The old woman contemplated this for a moment before answering. Those old sword immortals as well as some powerful figures from the 3 teachings are all keeping an eye on the Sword Chi Great Wall. As such, no major disturbances should occur. However, the type of people you speak of definitely exist. It's just that the Sword Chi Great Wall most likely isn't willing to air their dirty laundry. Young master, you don't actually need to pay too much attention to the situation over there. According to the intel gathered by the Ape Havoc estate, The current generation of young sword cultivators in the Sword Qi Great Wall is especially talented. Moreover, it's not just a few of them who are talented. Rather, they're like bamboo shoots after rain popping up with their sharp tips one after another. They can almost rival the group of sword immortals from 300 years ago. That generation was genuinely impressive, and they managed to suppress the demon tribe and deter them from provoking the Sword Qi Great Wall for a whopping 800 years. In fact, many members of the demon tribe never caught a glimpse of that Great Wall in their entire life. So, if you ask me, I'd say that Stalactite Mountain will enjoy peace and prosperity for the next few hundred years. The young boy felt slightly sad and he murmured, "The Lu clan might be making a lot of money, but we're profiting from the death of others." The old woman wanted to remind Lu Yuzhou to be careful of what he said in Stalactite Mountain. Upon seeing his downcast expression, however, she eventually couldn't bring herself to say anything. A steward from the Ape Havoc estate appeared in front of the young boy and the old woman. There were 2 horse-drawn carriages stopped by the side of the street, and the old steward said in a soft voice, "Young master, we have esteemed guests at the estate." Lu Yuzhou nodded in acknowledgement before stepping into one of the carriages. After arriving at the Ape Havoc estate, Lu Yuzhou saw a refined man as well as a tall woman. The scholarly middle-aged man was standing there and appreciating a painting, while the tall woman was sitting there and drinking tea. The man was seemingly a connoisseur of calligraphy and painting, and he praised, "Who would have thought that this is the authentic hunched old lotus painting? Sure enough, it exudes an outstanding strength and aura. In terms of painting lotuses alone, no one in the past 500 years has been able to rival this." While returning to the Ape Havoc estate, the old steward hadn't revealed the identities of the esteemed guests to Lu Yuzhou out of an abundance of caution. Only when entering the estate did he quietly inform Lu Yuzhou that the esteemed guests were the Emperor of Middle-earth Divine Continent's Great Duan Empire, as well as his imperial preceptor. Lu Yuzhou clasped his hands and bowed in respect, saying, "Lu Yuzhou pays his respects to your majesty and his imperial preceptor." The man turned around and smiled at the young boy, saying, "The imperial preceptor needed to borrow the small lake of lightning to temper her sword, so I also used this as an excuse to take a break from my busy schedule. I came to Stalactite Mountain to enjoy some fresh air, and I initially didn't want to disturb the Ape Havoc estate. However, I heard that young Master Lu was coincidentally in Stalactite Mountain as well, so I thought that I had to come here to visit no matter what." Lu Yuzhou clasped his hands and bowed again, saying, "Your Majesty is too polite." The Great Duan Empire was the newest member of the 9 large empires in Majestic World. It had conquered more than half the territory of some old empire, so the reinvigorated Great Duan Empire was busy with many tasks and changes. Thus, it didn't make sense for the emperor and his imperial preceptor to leave the empire together. However, these were secrets that the current Lu Yuzhou couldn't speculate about. Lu Yuzhou was well aware why the emperor of the Great Duan Empire was giving face to the Ape Havoc estate. The Great Duan Empire had succeeded in pulverizing the Supreme Mystery Empire, a former member of the 9 large empires. That war had been a nation-destroying one involving countless forces, and it had lasted for almost an entire decade. In the end, the Great Duan Empire had forcefully outlasted the Supreme Mystery Empire's Imperial Xie clan. During that war, Pure White Continent's Lu clan, or the money pouch of Lu Yuzhou's father to be exact, had made extremely big contributions. After Lu Yuzhou straightened his back, he turned to the female imperial preceptor of the Great Duan Empire before clasping his hands and bowing again. "I've admired imperial preceptor for a long time already." In reality, the Lu clan was a secret benefactor of the Great Duan Empire. As the future clan leader, there was therefore no need for Lu Yuzhou to be so polite and self-debasing. A rare smile appeared on the woman's face, and she put down her teacup and said, "Your personality is completely different from your father's. This is quite good." The emperor of the Great Duan Empire felt slightly uncomfortable and embarrassed. Could this be considered praise? The tall woman smiled and asked, "Have you been to the Sword Qi Great Wall before?" Lu Yuzhou didn't even sit down, and he remained respectfully standing as he shook his head and replied, "Not yet. Father won't allow me to go, lest anything untoward happen while I'm there." The woman thought for a moment before offering, "My only disciple is currently tempering his martial Tao in the Sword Qi Great Wall, so if young Master Lu is willing, you can travel with me to the Sword Qi Great Wall. There won't be any accidents." The old woman and the old steward of the Ape Havoc estate exchanged a glance. They both felt was a prickly situation. They weren't doubtful of the imperial preceptor of the Great Duan Empire, but this was something that pertained to their clan leader's wishes. As subordinates, they didn't dare to take matters into their own hands and make unauthorized decisions. Fortunately, Lu Yuzhou had already shaken his head and politely turned down the offer, saying, "I shouldn't go against my father's wishes. Please understand, Imperial Preceptor." The tall woman took no offense and she nodded and said, "It won't be long before my disciple needs to leave the Sword Qi Great Wall and Stalactite Mountain. At that time, having him train in pure White Continent will also be quite a good choice. If young Master Lu doesn't mind, you can bring my disciple along with you." Lu Yozhou's expression relaxed a little, and his voice also became much more carefree than before as he chuckled, "I'm more than happy to." He was only a young boy, after all, yet he was facing the fifth most powerful person from Middle-earth Divine Continent. Moreover, his father had long been peerless in pure White Continent, yet he still claimed that he could only rank at most 10th in Middle-earth Divine Continent. Upon seeing the tall woman stand up, the Emperor of the Great Duan Empire smiled and said, "In terms of when we're departing from Stalactite Mountain, I'll order someone to inform the Ape Havoc estate as soon as possible when I get back. There's no need to show us out, we're fine to leave by ourselves." The Emperor and his Imperial Preceptor walked out of the Ape Havoc estate. More accurately, the Imperial Preceptor and her Emperor walked out of the Ape Havoc estate. This was because no matter how one looked at them, it seemed as if the tall woman were the ruler of the Great Duan Empire, while the man was nothing more than her attendant or subordinate. Only after his two guests left did Lu Yuzhou sit down and tug at the collar of his bamboo robe. He was drenched in sweat. He glanced at the most prized treasure of the Ape Havoc estate, the hunched old lotus painting, and he ordered the steward, "Take it down, package it up properly, and deliver it to the Emperor of the Great Duan Empire." There was an uneasy expression on the old steward's face. Lu Yuzhou flashed a dazzling smile and reassured, "Listen to me." The old steward silently nodded and went off to carry out the young master's wishes. After the old steward removed the painting and carried it out of the main hall, the young boy looked at the suddenly empty wall and asked with a smile, "Grandma Lu, should we hang the painting of that young boy rowing a boat? What do you say?" Fear washed over the old woman, and she was just about to persuade her young master not to be rash. However, Lu Yuzhou was already chuckling to himself, saying, "I won't hang it here. When I get home, I'll hang it in my own room. Let's go, let's go. In order to express my sincerity, I'm going to paint a picture myself. Grandma Lu, make haste and tell the subordinates to bring me a calligraphy brush and ink." There was an amused expression on the old woman's face. There were 4 beautiful and delicate-looking maidservants in the Ape Havoc estate, and 2 of them were actually Qi refiners at the abode tier. They eagerly watched their young master exert much effort to paint that picture, and they appeared increasingly attractive and delicate as they did so. It took all of their willpower not to laugh. Lu Yuzhou was extremely proud of himself. Even though the painting was a bit ugly, it was undoubtedly filled with his sincerity. Indeed, Lu Yozhou's painting was just as wonderfully artistic as that person's handwriting on the wall in the wine shop. However, it was a pity that Lu Yuzhou hadn't bought himself a jar of golden millet wine at that time. Otherwise, he might have found himself a cherished friend upon seeing those worm-like characters. There existed a large wall in the world, upon which 18 characters were engraved. Dao Power, Grand Majestic Western Land. Thunderpool Restricted Land. Eternal Lasting Sword Qi. Qi Chandong Badass. After that wager, which had involved 13 fierce battles between elites from both sides, the demon tribe had gone back on their word. Not only had they refused to return all of the damaged swords strewn across the land to the south of the Great Wall, but they had even turned their embarrassment into anger and unleashed wave after wave of attacks. However, compared to their all-out assault from before the wager, when they had fought without caring about their lives, the 3 subsequent assaults had been intermittent and slightly less intense. According to rumors, many great demons in the demon tribe had been unwilling to launch those assaults. Thus, the demon tribe had failed to launch a united and powerful attack. Right now, the Sword Qi Great Wall was exactly the same as before. There were simply 18 extra characters on its surface. This was because the Sword Chi Great Wall was a barrier formation that had been created by the combined power of sages from the three teachings. Unless it was comprehensively destroyed in a short period of time, it would quickly recover and return to its original state. If this weren't the case, then it would have been annihilated and flattened long ago, regardless of how tall and sturdy it was. Moreover, the vicious attacks from the paramount great demons, as well as the fierce sword strikes from the generations of sword immortals on the city wall, would all give rise to boundless waves of peerless sword chi that cut through space and inevitably damaged the Great Wall. Swarms of demons were stationed 50 kilometers from the Great Wall, so great in number that they looked like endless clusters of ants. As of this moment, they had already paused their assault for more than 1 month. The Sword Chi Great Wall was experiencing a rare moment of peace. Just the path on top of the Great Wall measured a whopping 5 kilometers in width. An old man of unknown age was living in a thatched cottage on top of the city wall. The old man's descendants had already settled down and flourished with their own descendants in the city to the north of the Sword Chi Great Wall, and they had become one of the largest clans. However, the old man had never left the Great Wall before, guarding this place day after day, year after year. The old man had a strange temper, and he never allowed descendants from his clan to come here to visit him. Yet, he would occasionally smile in a kindly manner at children from other clans. Sword Immortal. Great Sword Immortal. The only difference was a single word. Yet the gulf between the two titles was like the gulf between heaven and earth. Similarly, there was also a huge gulf between the title of Great Sword Immortal and Old Sword Immortal in the Sword Chi Great Wall. This was because if a sword cultivator wanted to enjoy a long life in the Sword Chi Great Wall, they could only rely on their combat power, and not their surname or clan. As a member of the oldest generation still alive in the Sword Chi Great Wall, the old man had experienced far too many things. He had naturally experienced far too many disappointments as well. The most recent disappointment could perhaps be considered a big disappointment, even from the aspect of the old man who had lived for so many years. The old man was disappointed that he hadn't been able to participate in that battle due to the constraints of some rules. It was because of this that the immortal couple, his juniors, had died such disgraceful deaths. The old man had watched the two of them grow up, year by year, cultivation tier by cultivation tier, all the way until they became great sword immortals. To the old man, only watching youths like them grow up brought a bit of color and a sense of anticipation to his life. They made him feel like the worldly atmosphere wasn't regressing, and that young people were still very impressive. Tonight, the old man was sitting cross-legged on top of the city wall by himself. Save for his bonded flying sword, his other swords had already shattered one after another. In the end, he decided to stop using other swords. All of the elders and children in the Sword Chi Great Wall were extremely familiar with this old man of unknown age. However, the old man's temper was quite peculiar, so few people liked to interact with him anymore. Even so, a youth of unknown origin from the outside had come here a few years ago, and insisted on staying behind the old man's thatched cottage no matter what. He had eventually built himself a small thatched cottage there. During recent times, the young boy would simply guard his and the old man's thatched cottages every time the demon tribe attacked. Otherwise, he wouldn't actively participate in the battles. In fact, no one criticized the young boy from outside about this either. After all, he was only a pure martial artist at 4th tier. Thus, being able to persist and stay on top of the city wall was already quite the feat. The old man with sunken eyes and protruding cheekbones fell into deep thought. If it weren't on top of this city wall, and if it were in Majestic World on the side of Stalactite Mountain instead, it was very likely that not a single soul would believe it when they were told that this skinny and fragile-looking old man was referred to by the nickname of Old Great Sword Immortal, by some goofy person who had carved the character Badass on the Great Wall. A couple appeared behind the old man at this moment, and the old man didn't turn around as he said in a hoarse voice, "There's not much time remaining for the two of you. Is there anything else you need from me? Feel free to request anything as long as it doesn't interfere with the future direction of the two worlds. If it's your private matters, I can ignore all the rules and whatnot. In any case, I already broke the rules by forcefully collecting your damaged souls back at that time. Even then, those two oldies turned a blind eye to it." The man gently held his wife's hand, shaking his head and saying, "This is already very good." The woman shot a glare at her husband before correcting with a smile, "Yes, there is one thing. The old man squeezed out a smile and asked, "The mother-in-law is becoming more and more satisfied with her son-in-law? This is a good thing. It's much better than finding a useless good for nothing. Go on, tell me what you need. Do you want to give the young boy a celestial tool? Or do you want me to personally teach him sword techniques?" The woman hesitated for a moment before replying, "It might be even more difficult than that." The skinny old man turned around and asked, "Oh, how so?" There was helplessness on the man's face as he revealed. The young boy's bridge of immortality was shattered by someone. The old man frowned and said, "Sword cultivators are the most skilled in the world when it comes to destroying other people's bridges of immortality. However, trying to repair a bridge of immortality is even more difficult than ascending the heavens. Moreover, if I remember correctly, not a single person whose bridge of immortality was constructed by someone else has managed to advance to the upper 5 tiers and become a powerful sword cultivator. After all, cultivation itself is already an act of defiance against the heavens. If one repairs their bridge of immortality and sets foot on the path of cultivation after having their bridge shattered, they'll face even more scrutiny and anger from the heavens. It's extremely likely that the heavens will target them and never let go. Have the two of you genuinely made up your minds? Are you not afraid of making matters worse?" After saying this, the old man smiled faintly and continued, "After all, it might be difficult for others to ascend the heavens, but this is no big challenge for me." The woman was slightly hesitant. She and her husband had disagreements about this, with her husband holding the view that it was best to follow fate and go with the flow. Martial arts wasn't necessarily a bad option. However, as a sword cultivator who had stood on the mountain peak and witnessed majestic scenes before, the woman knew that the mountain peak of martial arts was lower than the mountain peak of chi refiners. This was the truth, and there were also historical reasons and grounds for this. She wasn't looking down on the young boy's martial arts cultivation, but she was rather worried about the slim possibility of him walking to the highest peak. The path of martial Tao led to a dead end, and the chance of someone reaching the peak was incredibly small. Moreover, what did a dead end imply? And what did the bridges of immortality of chi refiners imply? What should their daughter do at that time? The man smiled at her and said, "How about we leave things as they are? We'll let the young boy forge his own path. It's up to him how far he goes." However, the woman was still hesitant to let this go, and she asked, "Why don't we help him ask Grandpa Chan for a celestial tool? Perhaps we can treat this as a dowry for our daughter." Regardless of age, everyone in the Sword Chi Great Wall was accustomed to calling this old man Grandpa Chan. Only 2 people were exceptions to this rule. Of course, that one certain person who had put on a bamboo hat and left this place with a saber had also been an exception. The man huffed in anger and argued, to say nothing of whether he'll be able to use an unruly celestial tool in his lifetime. As a man, does Chun Ping'an need this kind of fated opportunity? The woman cut her husband off, stopping him from expounding his profound principles. "He's still just a young boy." The man was rendered speechless. Even though the old man liked this young couple very much, this didn't mean that he enjoyed listening to their trivial bickering. After hearing the young boy's name, however, he turned around again and asked, "The young boy's surname is also Chan?" The woman smiled and replied, "What a coincidence, right?" After drinking a few bowls of golden millet wine, the characters that he wrote on a whim on that wall were lasting sword chi. The old man smiled and looked at the couple. The man hurriedly shook his hands and said, "We definitely didn't plan this. Everything happened naturally." The woman also nodded earnestly with an honest expression. They were afraid that this respected old sword immortal would mistake them for scheming against him. If the old man became angry, the consequences would be unimaginable. The old man casually extended a hand, and thereupon a young boy in majestic world's stalactite mountain was dragged to the city wall in this world. Sword chi and sword intent flooded the surroundings, seemingly omnipresent like seawater as it ferociously funneled into the young boy's acupoints. This was a stifling aura. It was as if the young boy were a small fish that had initially been swimming happily in a stream. However, the small fish had suddenly been tossed ashore, and the so-called shore was actually a scorched and cracked piece of land. If the fish thrashed and struggled, the remaining water on its body would be immediately vaporized into nothingness. The old man observed the young boy who was hanging in midair above the city wall with an expression of pure agony. With a casual toss, He sent the young boy back to his original location in Stalactite Mountain. He smiled at the confused couple and said, "This is also quite good, isn't it?" Qian Ping'an swayed back and forth, and it took him much effort to finally stabilize himself. Right now, there was a talisman in his sword case that held the female bone ghost, whom he had subdued in Colorful Garment Nation. Qian Ping'an had suffered agonizing pain during this distant journey, yet the female bone ghost had actually suffered even more. In fact, she had almost been completely annihilated. Thankfully, the old man had only kept him there for a short moment. Moreover, there was Richian energy in the naturally formed locust residence in his sword case, and this had blocked out the large majority of sword chi. While hanging in the air, Qian Ping'an had seen a skinny old man as well as that husband and wife. At the same time, he had also stolen a glance at the city wall of the Sword Chi Great Wall. On the plaza at the foot of Lone Peak, a young girl with 2 swords by her waist walked out from the mirror-like gate and pondered for a moment. She slowed her pace slightly, yet her face was still devoid of emotion. However, she somewhat greeted the young Taoist priest who was frozen with shock, saying, "Compared to last time, I'm a tiny bit more familiar with you this time. Even so, we're still unfamiliar with each other. Such lawlessness. Is the Sword Chi Great Wall not going to do something about this?" The young Taoist priest murmured. The sword-hugging middle-aged man gazed up at the bright moon in the night sky. "How many people have died for the sake of you guys? Is Majestic World not going to do something about this?" he muttered to himself.